Right, this is going to be another episode of Thor Inquiry, and my guest for this one is a return guest. It is Jason Horsley, who is a long-time author on a wide variety of subjects. Obviously, people would say parapolitics, all sorts of different conspiracy elements, spirituality, UFOs. There's a million different angles we can go on this. And actually, I think on the last episode, if I'm right, because we were talking a bit about the Kubrick towards the end of that, I'm not sure. I think you actually hinted at the end. I think it was about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago or something. I think you actually hinted at the book that you published that I wanted to talk to you about this time, the one called Big Mother, where it's essentially the gist is, I would just put it this way. Most people conceive from fiction or history of, sort of dominant social structures or tyrannies as, I would say, like masculine. They see them as like fascistic, and essentially it's the vision of the Soviets, like a gun against your head. You do what we say or we kill you, put you in a gulag. But essentially the premise of this book that I found quite interesting, because it essentially allows us to look at what previously were described as the so-called Western liberal democracies. And you see, especially since the certain Koff event a few years ago, you can see how there's a tyranny that's there, but it's a bit more insidious. And so you kind of frame this as like a motherly aspect, right? And obvious question I want to ask you, Jason, because I've watched actually quite a few podcasts where you talked about this book, but I don't know that I ever saw anyone ask you this question. It seemed obvious to me. Since in your work, you're very forthcoming about your own personal life and history and your own family relationships, I feel like an obvious question to ask you is, does some degree of making the Big Mother hypothesis have any connection to your own relationship with your own mother?
It's funny you say that, because with Big Mother, I realized after I published it that I hadn't talked about my own mother fairly, even though, as you pointed out, I tend to include a personal autobiographical narrative woven in with the primary narrative. So in Prisoner of Infinity, for example, and Vice Kings, I write plenty about my father and my brother.
Yes.
And so seen, not seen, my brother's in there. So it occurred to me then that I must have a really big blind spot, that somehow that had happened. And anyway, so I wrote an extra page and then printed it out, thinking if I was going to hand out books at this book reading, I would include it. In fact,
right.
The books never showed up, but so I wasn't able to do that. But anyway, the point being is the whole page that I wrote, thinking this got left out of the book. It wasn't only about my mother. It was weaving it into the thesis a bit more, making I thought grounding it more. I don't remember what I wrote now, but it's a fitting question because of that. So I mean, one of the central things to me about what I have termed sometimes maternal psychic bondage, for example, maternal psychic enmeshment, or this psychic umbilical cord, or Big Mother indeed. We also call it the Norman Bates syndrome.
Right.
It is that it's hidden. It's hidden and it's not talked about. It obviously, Psycho is a very significant, influential movie and very popular and all the rest of it. So it's hidden in plain sight. Like it's a cliche, even, the mother's boy who is violent or destructive, or there are different angles to it that are cliched. The sailor with the mother tattoo on his arm,
sure,
and so on, right? So it's in plain sight, but that's one of the ways things get hidden, because we think we know it, but we really don't. So I recognize that for myself. Like I'd actually kept it somewhat concealed from myself. Not that I didn't know, obviously, that my own maternal enmeshment was relevant. I mean, that was how I first came upon the Big Mother hypothesis, really, I think, was by looking at my own life over the years. And somehow it converged with my research into socio-political, parapolitical, psychosexual, so a few adjectives in there, things, the world, how the world works, conspiratorially speaking, behind the scenes. Those two things intersected, like during this period between meeting my wife and beginning this series of books that Big Mother was the last of, I think. yeah, I was working on two things at once. One, I was trying to identify my own psychic enmeshment to my mother. This was from when I met my wife on. That was the basis of our relationship. But it was trying to untie this knot, and then this series of books that I began a couple of years later with Seen and Not Seen. So yeah, but it's not obvious. Like my mother wasn't was nothing at all like let's see, Joan Crawford's mother or Mrs.
Right.
Day, right? The cliche of the
Right.
domineering, ball-busting mother. She was the opposite, actually. She was more of a latchkey kind, just there was an alcoholic and just didn't really do much hands-on at all. She would flip out and lose her temper because she was frightening in that regard. But she wasn't obviously oppressive, and she wasn't obviously involved in our lives like mine and my brothers, maybe my brothers more so. But yeah, a superficial thing. She was a very uh, permissive, kind of free, non-interfering mother, you could say, to a fault, actually.
Right.
But nonetheless, at a subtler ways, whether or not we need to get into that, I don't know. I was definitely enmeshed in her psyche, no doubt about it. Probably still am to some degree. In fact, definitely still am because I can still see the symptom.
Well, one part I thought we could actually tie this into is this actually does tie into something I've been thinking about the last few years, which is whenever you see online people talking about topics like feminism and stuff, people often have a very simplistic view of it, where I've even heard people essentially use like almost like misnomers, the wrong terms, where they will say silly things which kind of show they haven't really thought about beyond the surface level. Like they'll say silly things like we live in a matriarchy, whereas it's like we don't really, like the more appropriate term is like gynocracy. It's more like it's still clearly run by men. And if you look at all these secret societies and all these institutions, there's still plenty of men doing all these things. And in fact, if you ever look at the history of feminism, it's clearly promoted by specific Tavistock Institute, all these people that are men and these male Masonic orders and stuff for whatever social change. But I do think there is something to the idea, which I think this ties into, that it's more like they've taken aspects of femininity or to be a woman and almost used those as ways to tyrannize society. Because as I say, if you asked a normie, I don't know about today. I mean, I feel like some of them maybe would be a little bit more sort of radicalized. But if you asked a normie even 10 years ago, I feel like they would say like, oh no, we do live in these like liberal Western democracies that are very free and there is no tyranny. In fact, they do those sinister things where they have like, an index of how free a country is. And it's obviously all these countries would score very, very highly, even though, by the way, they're the ones who do the indexing, I notice. But one thing I actually find interesting, because I've encountered this myself, it just being a figure within a niche scene where people will comment on you and attack you in certain ways, is actually a lot of these aspects, I find if you're a man, will be confusing initially. Like, I'll give you an example. I mean, maybe this is what you were hinting at there, which is essentially what I didn't understand and was very ill prepared for is women don't do battle publicly or try and control people in the same way as men do. So I think I only understood dealing with other men from being a boy and being a man and making my way in a man's world and all that sort of jazz. But when I look at it, a lot of the way women will communicate and actually sort of attack each other and people in general, it is based on almost like Evo psych of the idea that they can't overtly just come at you and sort of use force, because that typically has been where they didn't have the edge. They have to sort of have things like, I would say like force civility, where essentially just think about if someone did a journalism interview, a hostile interview with someone where they were trying to make you look silly on TV. They wouldn't actually do the old school thing of just berate you in a really loud voice. They'd probably do something like sort of make it sound like, but why can't you just accept people for who they are? And it's almost like they're trying to sound like they're really a lovely person and you're just stepping out of line. But in some ways, they're actually kind of tyrannizing you. I'll even say I noticed there's a very clever angle they can use where on the one hand, if what you say outrages them, they can use emotion as an appeal aspect to make you seem wrong. But then if, for example, you get jazzed up from that and you sort of are a little bit feisty with how you respond, they can also make you look bad for being overly emotional. In fact, you're not calm and have this forcibility. Would you have any thoughts on this kind of a topic? Because I feel like this really feels insidious to a lot of people. I feel like if you asked, like I say, a normie 10 years ago, they wouldn't really see this. They would see it as like, no, people are just trying their best and, we're trying to be a community in these things. But I kind of see like I've almost seen these used as weapons to me. What do you think?
Well, I don't know what to respond really. I mean, I agree with everything you said, but it's so broad. I mean, there's so many different angles. So it's a question of which angle of approach to take here. So,
do you think this is intentional? Like, is this part of the control system, like a different way to control, like contrasted with past ages?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, actually, that's a very broad question, and it could apply to any number of different things beside this one specific subject. But on this specific subject, it's both. I think that there's an intentional agenda to kind of weaponize femininity. You could even see feminism. It's so confusing to try and talk about this because early feminism, one of the criticisms of it, valid, was that it was indoctrinating women just to be more like men and
Sure.
to be hostile towards men and an attempt to kind of supplant them. So, so that's one way of weaponizing femininity, where you turn it into masculinity. But this is a much subtler way where you it's almost more like turning it is like turning masculinity into femininity, which obviously is written large with the transgender phenomenon, which is mostly male to female. They don't actually necessarily attempt to transform themselves. But anyway, what you're pointing out is that as far as control and manipulation, exploitation and oppression, the female method in many situations actually is more effective.
Yeah.
Right. So, and you're pointing out why, because it's, I mean, in the sort of interpersonal level, it's called passive aggressive. I mean, that's one way of simplifying it. The care trolling is another. Like if you say, I think you need some help, or maybe you should take a nap and you'll feel better. You know, that's mothering, but that's also insulting. It's demeaning.
Yes.
And it's belittling, and it's suggesting that there's something wrong with you, which obviously that's shaming as well. So that all of that can be very effective. And as you say, one doesn't have a very easy recourse because if one responds with anger and hostility, one's fallen into the trap. Just as one simply submits. There's two kinds of traps, and if so it's gaslighting. We can throw gaslighting in there as well. You're not entirely sure, is this an act of hostility or isn't it? So anyway, so gosh, what's next from here? I mean, to bring it all the way out to something that you're talking about, trying to convey this to normies. Well, it is extremely difficult. Like I wrote a book on it, and I find it very difficult to talk about the subject. So, but one easy in is since 2020 with the we know what since then. The totalitarianism became it was using medical language and medical policies as its means to extend itself and to increase its control, and that was to do with safety. It was to do with personal safety, protection, caring. Like the medical establishment is supposed to be about those things. So it's much clearer. Orwell's Big Brother is clearly about the state in terms of political and military kind of control. Big Mother is about the state in terms of more administrative and medical forms of control. And these are opposite energies, right? One is the father energy is disciplinarian and using force, and the mother energy is nurturing and caring, but supposedly, right? Yes. But it's mothering, obviously, in the negative aspect, it's mothering. So it's both. I mean, these two things are working together, just as men and women who are complicit with this, which is kind of everybody, but I mean, more consciously or more demonstrably complicit, they're also working together. So we see that women have literally become vastly more powerful in the last 50 years. It's hard to tell how much is accurate compared to what is in the media, but if you watch any TV show now, the chief of police or the judges or these high-level administrative roles are played by women, often black women. Obviously, that's a messaging, but it's also representing a reality. Like it's circular, they're complementary. So that's a literal equivalent, but the much subtler level is, as you're pointing out, well, men are still largely in control. I mean, it's impossible to say for sure because we don't know at the
Sure.
high levels, but I think it's probably pretty likely that whatever today's equivalent of Kissinger is, which is not to say, that's not, he wasn't that hidden, but he was somewhat of a hidden hand. Well, whoever the equivalent of Kissinger is today, I was thinking Musk actually, but he's obviously very high profile, but they're probably male too. But even if they are, and even if we talk about Masonic societies or whatever secret societies, Council of Foreign Relations is quite mixed, I think. Even insofar as we're talking men who are calling the shots and dictating the agendas, which, as I say, I think it's becoming less and less exclusively so. That we still have to raise the question of, are these men actually controlled internally by something that we could identify as feminine, i.e. their own mother complexes and whatever is using that as a lever, because that's Psycho, that's the narrative of Psycho. It was his mother complex, but then there's something demonic that's possessing him through the mother complex.
Sure. I mean, along the idea of the mother archetype, I even think there's something quite interesting that clearly your book speaks to, which is this idea that, as you say, an obvious example of how it manifests is what you would call like protectionism, essentially. The idea that like the number one priority is everyone is safe all the time, and everyone can almost hear their own mother's voice there. The idea that, like, I'll give you the obvious analogy. When you're a kid and you get the bike, and you get the stabilizer wheels, it's not going to be your mum that says, let's get those wheels off, he's ready to ride. That's going to be your dad who says that. That's sort of the fatherly energy of sort of like, test yourself, try and see if you can do it, be more than you are. The motherly thing's like, no, don't do that yet. Like, he'll fall, he'll hurt himself, right? That obviously this is the way I always try to explain it to people. To me, that's, even though it's dark how it's manifesting now, the sort of white pill for me is that seems to be hijacking what in theory is a very positive quality of women, that they do actually care about people and try to protect them and lift you up if you fall down, etc., and comfort you, etc. It's just obviously, as you can see in that analogy of the bike, it's supposed to be sort of balanced out, and there's a bit of give and take and push and pull there that sort of keeps both sides from being too extreme. And so I noticed the way this tends to manifest in society, aside from, as you said, I actually think the best analogy is obviously the famous incident the last few years with certain flus and whatnot. But I would say, I was thinking about this the other day. It's even the way that they appeal to what they want you to do is so different in this gynocratic big mother system, as opposed to, as you say, like Big Brother would be the 1984, the big father type archetype. If you think of it this way, the big father archetype is basically like a father, like, do this because I say so, and or it's the right thing to do. If you do the motherly aspect, it's more like, hey, listen, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You have freedom and free will, but you know what? You really should do this though, shouldn't you? You'd be kind of a bad person if you didn't. In some ways, what's funny is you'd think the former would be more effective, but I actually do think the latter's like perniciously effective, because it almost gaslights you that it was your idea to do it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, guilting. So a lot of it is guilting. Yeah. So, and what I think we've seen, I think it's the next level really, and that complementary again, because you're thinking that abuse, the sort of abusive or oppressive kind of big brother control, which uses fear, primarily uses fear, as bad fathering. Well, that does create a kind of Stockholm syndrome in which one is likely to bond with the abusive father, despite the fact that, or because they're abusive, right? So one is internalizing those qualities against one's own nature and one's own interests, really, in order to feel safe. And I think so the next phase of that, or they're complementary, so actually the mothering comes first, but the back and forth, it goes back and forth. But the feminine, the mothering phase is what you're saying is more guilting, which really makes the internalization complete.
Yes.
Because it's not just, then it's more consciously, I'm going to do this because I want to do it, because I want to be a better person, because I would feel bad if I don't. And so then it becomes more actively, that person then becomes a more active instrument of the agendas. And so then we have the inmates policing themselves, and over time we don't need guards anymore.
Yes.
That seems to be the ultimate objective, really.
By the way, I noticed we're doing a good job sort of talking around this, but I'll ask more of a pointed question about that incident 4 or 5 years ago, but I'll do it in an abstract way. It goes like this. I actually would like to know, I've heard you talk about that topic, but often in hindsight, I'd actually like to know, what was your initial response to seeing how other people reacted to that? Because I will say one thing that shocked me, and this is where I almost realised I can be quite naive myself. I've for years studied a lot of like conspiracy ideas, and a lot of people would say in my industry, I mean, in my industry as a journalist, I'm nearly always like sadly having to critique people and find out that people are scumbags or liars or corrupt, or, you know, what, even if they're like doing it accidentally, they didn't say the thing they actually said before, which they claim they didn't, you know. So when you're looking into these areas, I normally am pretty cynical with my view on people I don't know. I just kind of take the idea of like, you know, what could they do bad? What would they do? Like, what's the lowest they'll sink to? But actually, I was a bit shocked, mate. Like what you're just saying at the end there, part of me always felt like tyranny would on some level have to always be like quite expressly top down. But the thing that shocked me the most was it was quite gentle, a lot of the top down stuff during that event. Actually, a lot of the pressure came socially. It came from literally not only people in media and the, you know, the wider community. It would come from your own families, from your own work environments, from your own friend groups. Like somehow they did make people internalize this sort of battle or tyranny, and people did do it to each other. People were their brother's keeper and their own guards and jailers and their own jailer in some way. Like, was that something that was surprising to you? Did you find it exaggerated? Was it in line with what you were expecting? What do you think?
Well, yes, I was pretty much expecting that, but at the same time, it's impossible not to be in it and be affected by it. So I think it's both, essentially. I didn't have, I got a very small family. Really, I've got a sister and a niece, really. That's pretty much it that I'm in contact with. And so there was no, and I don't have a job and so on. Well, actually, I mean, back during when it began, I was running a thrift store. And in a way, I was having the opposite experience because our client base was almost all working class or even non-working class.
Right.
You know, druggies and street people and so on. And there wasn't, but we didn't observe the rules and we stayed open and so on and didn't even wash our hands or wear masks or anything like that. And we would tell people, you can take your mask off, you don't have to wear your mask and so on. And no, I don't think anybody complained, and a lot of people were actually appreciative, and so I actually had a surprising experience in that regard, even though I was hearing about more secondhand and somewhat witnessing what you're talking about. I was also seeing the opposite, people who just weren't going along with it. So in that sense, that was a pleasant experience, and it was fairly surprising. I have had the experiences you're talking about, actually more in Spain, I think.
Oh, wow.
On 2 occasions I got verbally attacked. Well, they were one occasion they were English on the train for not wearing the mask. And I have to say I didn't deal with it very well. I mean, I'm really, in that sense, it is surprising. Like I say, when it's actually happening, it's always surprising because for people to be that obnoxious and that ignorant, it doesn't surprise me intellectually, theoretically, but it affronts me, it infuriates me. So that's the same, really. If you get affected by it, obviously you're not, you've been taken off guard by it. So I think I don't know. It's probably healthy, really, to be surprised by it in a certain sense.
Right.
Otherwise, one has given up on people, right?
True. Yeah.
Expect them to be like, drones of the superstate. One doesn't ever really want to be in that frame. And we don't actually know, except from direct experience. This is one of the pernicious things about the media today. I mean, the way that we get our media, maybe it's always been that with mass media, but more and more so. We don't really know how much of it's being manipulated and shaped.
I mean, you never know what a poll is of someone or what people genuinely think, right? It's hard to know.
That's what I mean. We don't know the number. We do know that there are people like we're talking about.
Yes.
Because we both encountered them. And there is a lot of them. There are a lot of them for sure. But we don't know in terms of the actual percentage. But anyway, I mean, the main thing is, I think what we're talking about here is that people being turned against each other, but only by being turned against themselves, first of all. So that's that is an almost impossible situation. If you have somebody who is becoming an instrument of what you know is a draconian, destructive, malevolent agenda, and they're fighting you to defend it and to advance it. Well, the appropriate really response is absolute pity for that person, but it's very hard, very
Yes.
hard to not be in a defensive and an aggressive response to that because they're attacking you.
Yes. I know on the last episode, I asked more generally in sort of a conspiracy sense, did you see like that notion that's often bandied around for like a great awakening? Did you see that people do that in general? Because I have to say that's one of the things I don't really personally see that much. I certainly see a lot more interest and a lot more mainstream overlap for things like conspiracy thinking, the occult, etc. But actually, if anything, I just see that to me, the system still seems like it works fantastically. It brings people under its spell. It sort of characterizes things a certain way, especially fiction does a fantastic job of making people think of certain people as the enemy, certain people as the friend, certain people good, certain people bad. So I want to actually ask on that specific topic we were just referring to, that particular event, I think that's one of the number one areas in the conspiracy world that's presented as, or the reason it ended, if indeed it did end. It seems like some parts of the world it hasn't ended, but we'll leave Americans out of this. The notion that it ended is often told in hindsight as the idea of like, people wouldn't put up with it anymore and the social pressure was so much, the managerial class had to adapt and sort of let everyone out of their homes and all that jazz. I don't know if I see it that way, mate. Like part of me feels like that's the opposite. And actually, I almost see, from my perspective, it was like actually gradually they reduced sort of the restrictions. And then it was, if anything, I saw people the other way around, like they adapted to that and were like, okay, yeah, I guess it's not that big a deal. And then the joke is now people don't even use a lot of those terms, even though a lot of the exact same conditions and, kind of death rates would still apply. Like now people have just sort of been conditioned that it almost never happened, or it doesn't matter, or it was over, or maybe they agree, maybe they think they won. Essentially, actually, that's probably the best way to phrase it. I think a lot of outsider people think they won that battle, whereas to me, it almost just feels like, for whatever reason, the control structure just relaxed a bit. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I certainly haven't seen any evidence that there was any victory in the sense you're talking about. I think there was the feeling like, is this going to just carry on? Is it going to get worse? And then
I actually was worried, mate, it would just last like 15 years or something. I was thinking it was going to be like some Soviet Union shit or something. I was kind of scared at the time, I've got to admit.
Yeah. And then when it didn't, there was some relief and some surprise. I don't know if I was that surprised. I mean, I was prepared for it to carry on and get worse. The thing is, I've been prepared for things like this, not in the specifics, but in terms of a martial law and a totalitarian, big brother state. Since my 20s, I've anticipated this. So that's 30 years. And so I'm never that surprised if it doesn't happen, because it's like the UFOs, they keep promising, but it never happens, right?
Yes.
But what I see is what does happen. So I don't know why anyone would try and frame it that in a positive light, what happened, because it was so sobering and disturbing. And to this day, I mean, people have been gaslit, and people have been they've been inundated with disinformation to the point that they really can't think clearly, and they're not thinking for themselves, and that just seems obvious. So to me, I mean, I don't even know what people think now as far as around the vaccines, for example. Like, has it been proved and established that they were harmful and ineffective? I think largely is the impression I get, and even mainstream sources. Or another example, like, was the virus released or got out of the laboratory?
Right.
But that's officially approved now. That's the officially approved narrative. But are people going along with that, or would some people still say you're a conspiracy theorist if you said that? Probably they would. So there's some sort of weird fragmentation that's going on. Anyway, and coming back to the vaccine thing, well, the same people, as far as I know, many of the same people who were aware or convinced that it was a bad thing, and now feel validated that it's been more or less acknowledged that it wasn't a good idea, are behind the Stargate thing.
Yes, true,
right?
true.
The same people.
Yeah.
So I don't think it really counts. I think people are looking at the wrong,
Yes.
in the wrong places for the evidence. What's going on here is as far as I see it, and of course I'm in it too. Like I'm a victim of it too. Not that I like to use the V word for myself, but I'm subjected to the same weapons. Is at a much subtler level, and I don't want to just reduce it to the internet, because obviously the internet is just really one aspect of it, but in a certain sense it's the main aspect, because absolutely everybody is now living on and through the internet. And so our consciousness is being fused now with technology through the internet, and the way that we think and perceive, and therefore the way we act, is being more than influenced. It's being determined and regulated now by, well, I could say AI. I mean, there's a whole topic
Sure.
we might have to get into today, because when I wrote Big Mother, there was no AI, but now suddenly there is an AI. I mean, that in itself is a big head scratcher. How the hell did that happen so quickly, right? But anyway, to finish my main point, was that's the level at which we're being deceived. It doesn't even matter now what most people think, I don't think, because they're just being given those thoughts. And yes, those thoughts they include their opposites, if you know what I mean. So there's conspiracy consciousness is widespread and mainstream now. I mean, half the people who voted for Donald Trump, not the voting counts, but whatever, they think that they got him in. They are conspiracy.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Right, to a fault. I mean, in a way that has completely, obviously, been useful to conspirators.
Yes. No, I'd even say as well, that's an example of how every topic can seemingly be sanitized by the mainstream and used to their own ends. By the way, I agree with you on the whole thing of how people, I know what you mean. It's almost like whichever camp you were in before the event ended, you think you won anyway. So if you were in the camp that thought the protectionism was right, you just tell yourself it did work, and now it's succeeded enough. You know, we've got, the tools to combat it, that we can remove the restrictions. Yeah, it's all fine. So we were fine. But I agree. The people who thought we've got to push back against this, the joke is some of them think they won because the official source told them what they thought anyway, which I would just say to them, but wasn't your whole thing that official sources always lying and just manipulating you? So why would that be what you'd need to confirm it for you? That seems a bit off in itself. I know what you mean. I would say this though, one thing I wanted to ask was probably the most interesting part I thought about the way you framed this topic in your book is when I even saw the name Big Mother and I heard some of the initial thoughts and you talking on podcasts about it. I had a sense for what some of it was about, but I was only thinking again from the top down, the control structure, the people with the social engineers and the conditioning. I thought one of the most interesting parts you sort of addressed there is almost the notion that they're also playing to something within the person who they're victimizing. Like the notion you put that essentially on some level, you're not just encouraging it, but I think on some level humans do want to, as you say, return to the womb and this idea of safety and everything. I mean, you can see how the managerial state would be perfect for this. They'll take care of everything for you. They'll give you the welfare. They'll give you money if you don't have a job. They'll put you in a little program. They'll keep the baddies away. If they do, that's debatable today, but whatever. There's a notion they do, etc. This idea, it's not just do this. On some level, they're also trying to appeal to something within us. I do think people have that notion. I mean, anyone who's ever met someone who was an addict of hard drugs, it's not a cliche. They are, in a way, sort of trying to escape off to some warm, vague, fuzzy world where they don't have to worry about today's problems. In a way that it is a retreat to the womb, what would you say about that aspect? Because it's clearly not, again, just they're making you do something. They're trying to sort of appeal to a desire within us, a latent desire, maybe.
Yeah, it's a latent in the sense it's been incepted or caused in us very early on, both individually, as in our own traumatic experiences of being in the womb and being born, that meant we weren't able to separate in a healthy psychological way from the mother's body. So that was all, insofar as that's the case with each of us individually, that's a result of the the social and parapolitical structures and rituals and ceremonies and manipulations and whatnot that we were born into. But then also it goes very far back collectively in terms of the species, which is obviously harder to talk about. We don't know directly, but we don't even know, the history that we have to refer to is not clear on this. But anyway, there's this, all of civilization really has been moving towards this point that we're moving towards, which is the creation of a matrix, of a second womb, of a simulated reality in which we're getting everything directly fed to us as if through a technological umbilical cord.
Right.
So, Musk has the brain link now.
Sure.
And whatever else the technology is offering, it's essentially this. Transhumanism is about us downloading our consciousness into the machine, but the flip side of that with the brain link and AI is the machine gets downloaded into our consciousness. So it's a two-way thing. But anyway, we can trace that back if we want to, as I do with Big Mother, to the very earliest forms of technology, which would be fire, if you call that technology. Fire itself isn't technology because it's elemental, but the
wielding it or whatever, sure.
Wielding of it, control of it. That separates us from our environment, obviously, in different ways. We can cook food, we can stay warm, and so on.
Yes.
And then language being, I don't know which came first, fire or language, probably fire. And they both kind of correlate with Prometheus, this idea of the gift of the gods, or stolen from the gods. And language also, of course, in different ways separates us from our environment, but also it separates us from our own consciousness. That's a big subject, but it's very central to Big Mother. And language is the basis of our technology now, it's computer technology. So, all of this has to do with it's archetypal or mythological or spiritual, like a deep spiritual polarity, I think, which is between mother and father. If we think of, for example, the mother is to do with earth and matter and being embedded in matter and subservient to matter in some way, which is healthy and natural up to a point. Obey the law of matter is one of their maxims. We have to observe matter. We can see what happens if you try and transcend the laws of matter. That's part of the pathology, but it's not our essential or our higher nature. This would be the paternal, which is the father, which is the spirit, and that is a different orientation. It's a higher orientation. So, so I'm not sure how to tie all this up, but as far as creature comforts, really, it's a kind of animalistic, but is an instinct, therefore it's animalistic. Yes. The instinct to be safe, to be secure, to be warm, to be comfortable. There's nothing wrong with all these things. But at a certain point, bring it back to the mother thing, like mothering becomes unhealthy at a certain point because we're supposed to have grown up. We don't need eternal energy. So the same with, obviously, we still need matter, we still need a physical body, but our allegiance to doesn't need to be to matter, as in we don't need to be prioritizing our physical comfort, because spirituality is why I have a Substack called Children of Job, based on the Book of Job. Spirituality is about deprioritizing personal comfort and physical survival even, and prioritizing the soul or our spiritual destiny or our spiritual purpose, which has to transcend physicality, because otherwise it's not going to outlive our lives. It's not going to last past death, right? It's not going to transcend death. So I think that's, I know I brought it out, a very large thing there, but in terms of the complicity, it's very deep. It's very deep. You could think, Garden of Eden, right? The sin, the temptation, the knowledge of good and evil, and then the fig leaves to cover them up. Or the fig leaf that's the first clothing,
sure.
That first comfort, the first shelter. the first kind of unnatural aspect to enter into the garden, or artificial. So that's very basic and very fundamental. And these two things are complementary. Then you might say, well, it's just about people being stuck on physical comfort and what we're saying, all these technological luxuries, and getting lured by that. Yes, but we all have it in us.
Yes.
We're all backing away from our spiritual destiny,
Yep.
which is really to be completely naked and exposed and without anything that protects us. Well, at all, I was going to say, I mean, except God, but it's God we want to be protected from, right? So in a way that doesn't exactly work, but you don't need protection from God, if you see what I mean. Like if you're aligned with your soul, your spiritual wisdom, you don't need protection, I think. So, but it does require going out all the way out on that limb, like going out without the safety net, a kind of intrepidness that very few of us have. So that's how I mean, yes, it's in all of us, and it goes all the way back. It goes all the way back. Whatever went wrong, some people listening won't be inclined towards a religious framework,
Sure.
maybe even yourself. But whatever went wrong, it goes all the way back to there, and it relates to this, that we chose comfort over freedom or over truth.
Obviously, this book was largely talking like about society and bigger ideas, but I actually did, like you did here, I kind of related it quite personally. I have to say that idea stuck with me, because I have to say, if I look cynically at my own life, that has actually often been the sort of pendulum swing of my life. Like, put it this way, I've often talked about, in my career, I've been quite prolific with how many pieces of work I've done in my little niche area. So people will think I'm incredibly hardworking, and sometimes I am. But I was someone who, when I was much younger, I had sort of the min-max approach to life, where I really did think life was about sort of getting away with it, and that if you were smart or talented, the main purpose of having smarts or talents was the idea you could just sort of like do something brilliant that would just take you less time than someone else, and then you could get away with not doing work, which is, that's where I'm coming from. And then I developed discipline and, tried to be consistent and do things every day. But even to this day, I still sort of veer between, my default state is to try and have a purpose in life and a direction, and to do things and to create things and pursue ideas and build, etc. And I'll even say there's an aspect to which I also, part of me even realized over time, it isn't just that people are attacking me. Part of me wants to sort of also battle people and face the world and take things on. But then I also have a part of me where if I ever let up, if I ever take a few days off, or I give myself a week off, or I'll give in to feeling lazy, or I can easily just go a few weeks and just do the bare minimum and smoke weed and watch TV programs and almost completely retreat into, just like you said, just creature comforts, just kind of just forget about all the outside. And I find I veer between the two. It's not one or the other, and I've never quite gone only one way or the other. So I would ask, are you personally someone who relates to something like this? Is it something in your life you experienced beyond just the control structure?
Yeah, of course. Although it's, I mean, I don't think I could I certainly couldn't go back to smoking weed, but even like just lying around watching TV, would be hard for me now, I think. But it's subtler than this, because one can also retreat into activity. One can retreat into compulsive activity. So there's plenty of people who are not lazy, who should be. I mean, it'd be better off.
Okay.
Better off if they were doing less stuff. So recently I did Lent. I took 40 days off for Lent, off the internet, and just went and lived in this little stone house in the vineyard that we have here in Spain. And it wasn't, I didn't strip things down as much as I might have done if I'd been more gung-ho about it, like Jesus in the desert. I mean, he didn't have anything for 40 days. He didn't even have bread. So I wasn't fasting, and I wasn't, I was busy, let's put it this way. But a lot of what I was doing, most of what I was doing was, besides weeding the vineyard and walking, very long walks, was reading. So I was reading a lot of books, and I do have a project now. But I would say that the main thing was to actually get away and learn not to be more lazy, but to relearn or remember how to let go of the need to compulsively do stuff in order to feel like my life has purpose. Because I don't personally believe, I don't see there's any case to be made for our purpose being in this world, essentially. I mean, obviously we are in this world. So if we have a purpose, it's going to unfold in this world. But I don't see how it can really have any reference point in this
But there has to be some sort of higher calling to you or some sort of spiritual dimension.
It has to have to do with the
Right.
invisible and with the eternals. So a God-given purpose. So So what does God want of me? And so I wanted to reconnect to that sense. And so a lot of that is introspection, prayer. I was reading the New Testament, just trying to get my coordinates reset, or get my compass reset so I could see which way was forward. And so that's, to me, that's the dilemma. It's not necessarily about being active or inactive. It's about, is my activity productive in a spiritual way, and is my inactivity also productive, if that's the right word there, if it's bearing fruit internally. So what were we saying with this? Well, yeah, so yes, I have a constant back and forth, really. It can be every day, but if I'm on a roll, then maybe I get through a whole week where I feel like I'm in my orbit, as it were, and I kind of know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, in a sense, but it's not as literal and as cognitive as that. I just feel connected to a purpose. But then it can dwindle a little bit, and then I start to wonder, like, am I just spinning my wheels here? So it's, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what it would take to never have that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's certainly better to have that than not have it if one is. I mean, there are lots of people who don't question, and they should.
Yeah, that's fair.
So that's worse. It's worse to be not really know what you're doing and not even be questioning it. That's worse than to maybe you're on your course, but you keep questioning it anyway, which is unnecessary. It's just a habit. But at least you're checking, right? Just check. Just keep checking, right? So, and I think, you see, my main imperative, and this relates to Big Mother, really, with AI, for Lent, was just to get offline, because the internet gives this false sense of purpose so easily and so quickly and so insidiously. Like, one can feel like one is getting somewhere.
Yes.
Right? Because you get likes and you get hits and you get this and you get that, and it's not. I mean, we don't even know really who's liking it.
No, exactly. I often call it just like imaginary internet hearts, because it's like, I know what you mean. Everyone does feel good when you get this stuff, but you do wonder, like, is that even a bot doing that? Is that even a person? Like, what am I getting off on here?
Yeah, and what are we giving our time and our energy to?
True.
Non-rhetorical question, because yes, okay, to some extent we're giving it to one another and we're connecting, and that can have a meaning in the other dimensions, in the physical world, away from the internet, but then beyond that, in the spiritual world, beyond the physical, it can. But we're also giving our energy, time, and attention to the machine, the artificial intelligence thing, the Big Mother, right? The Big Mother state. We're feeding it. We're feeding it with our life force. So that's the thing. There's no neutral setting as far as, are we on our course? Are we fulfilling our purpose? Or are we just spinning our wheels? Well, if we're spinning our wheels, we're actually serving something else. We're serving the anti-life thing. I don't think there's any middle way, really. Your actions are either enhancing and deepening your connection to reality, or they're further muddying it and diminishing it.
Just to pick up on what you're talking about there, as sort of a sidebar angle for a moment, one thing I would also ask is this. Another thing I've been sort of mulling over quite a lot recently is when I do think of things like that event 5 years ago, I'm actually, because I had a similar grounding, it sounds like to you, in sort of like conspiracy thinking and stuff, and the idea that like there'll be this, like you say, the classic one is the martial law takeover, and the idea that they literally with guns will force you to do these things, and that's what all the tech's going to be for, is to like quite literally monitor you and Big Brother style, know everything you're doing and shut you down. I'm actually almost shocked by how soft the touch is sometimes from the control structure. Like part of me did expect them to go super, super hard in that regard. So one thing I wonder about sometimes is, if you want to even take a spiritual angle on this, one thing that people would say who are not expressly in the like traditional Christian framing would be, they would say, oh, the devil exists and he is what would be considered to a spiritual being, a negative entity in the sense that he's the lord of the earth and the material realm. And if you look at the world that way, his mission, or whatever this force would be, this archonic force, would just be to make you obsessed with the material and to make you ignore the spiritual and just exist only in the material. And in some ways, that might mean things that we think of as freedoms in the real world, as like, you know, you get to party and you get to listen to music and watch shows like we're saying, things that people interpret as good could actually be seen as tools of evil, obviously. Whereas if you look at the other direction, it seems like what people paint as holy or sacred, it tends to be this notion of you're transcending the physical, you're going towards some sort of spiritual dimension, something in the mind, in the spirit, whatever. Essentially, what I'm trying to ask is this. Is the control system just more pernicious than I'm realizing? Is it on some level already concerned up to a certain point? Does it want to completely control? If we just do some of the things it wants, does it kind of leave us alone a bit? What do you think?
I think it is as pernicious as it can be. I think it's trying to harvest us at soul level, not just control us physically.
Right.
I was thinking while you're talking there, I have to pause and think.
Because essentially I'm almost sort of asking, do the Archons just want to control us, or do they actually want us, are they demons who want us to suffer, in a sense, if you want to use that model?
Suffer.
You think it's the latter?
Well, I mean, so there's more than one question there, because
sure.
you're also asking about, I think, is it just physical control? Or at least I got that from,
on some level,
from what you were saying, because getting people to focus just on the material, you see, because actually, in a weird way with the internet, people are focusing less and less on the material, and that's not good either. So I think that the realm in which the Archons, if you want to call them that, these forces of control that are only somewhat human, like there's a human level and then there's this non-human level, they're working, as I've said already today, they're working at a much subtler level than the physical, and they work so that what they're luring us into is a psychic domain, really. And so they're appealing to all kinds of psychic fancies and fantasies.
Sure.
Which are, yes, they are hooked into the body. They're about the kind of physical satisfaction, even the physical satisfaction instead of going back to the womb. You still exist physically in the womb. So the comfort that you're having is paradoxically, it's a physical comfort of being almost non-physical, you could say, right? Because you can't even distinguish your own body from the mother's body. So then it's a psychic comfort, because it's the ultimate psychic comfort, because the body is like it doesn't really exist. So I think that's what they're luring us into, is a kind of disembodiment, which is hooked into the physical craving for comfort, for satisfaction, and away from discomfort, and is using to do so all of these kind of psychic bait, the things that will stimulate us psychically, psychologically, emotionally. And so it's not quite as cut and dried as appealing to a materialistic or enforcing a materialistic viewpoint, or a purely physical orientation. There is that aspect we saw again with the pandemic, scamdemic, whatever. that it was very much about the physical survival, protection, and
Yes.
all that, the fear of death. Absolutely, that's definitely one of the main levers of control. But I'm saying that there are these subtler ones that have to do with this, and creating a fantasy playground in which we can be just constantly, endlessly stimulated. And that's the internet and whatever the internet is leading us into. And that's also some sort of afterlife bardo realm that may well exist, co-created by us with these archons or demons.
Right.
They can lure us into that while we're alive, then we'll end up there when we die, and then they'll be able to feed on our souls for an indefinite period. Pretty horrific scenario. So then it's not, it's paradoxical, because in order to counteract that, our orientation needs to be to the spiritual and the eternal, beyond the psychic, beyond these fantasies and these occult kind of realms of empowerment, but also complementarily, like, how are we going to connect to spirit? It has to be through the body and through becoming more physical, more conscious of our physical existence, and more engaged in physical interaction with nature, with matter. I mean, obviously, interacting directly with nature is, well, that's limited.
Sure.
Be Jeremiah Johnson, and even he built himself a log cabin.
Sure.
So it's with tools and wood and stone and whatever it is, having animals and so on. That seems to be, I think that's indispensable as far as getting away from this lure, from this trap. And that's very much part of the control system that's unfolding now, as it's becoming more and more criminalized to do stuff like that, to do your own thing. You can't even have, if you have cats in Spain now, it's illegal not to have them fixed.
Oh,
right?
wow, right.
We tried to give away kittens and the police came to our door.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah. So that's an example. You can't
I've heard similar stories. Supposedly there's places in America where it's actually illegal to just like collect your own rainwater, like, what would seem like a very harmless thing.
Yeah. So that's going on. Like,
right.
It's got the absolute complete control of everything we do is going on. The reason it's soft, but also the psychic luring us into complicity, and that's the reason it's softer, because to the extent that people have been lured into the complicity by these psychic enticements, they don't need to be controlled. They don't need to be told not to gather rainwater, because it would never occur to them to do that.
By the way, along those lines where you're talking about the notion that you could almost envision the digital space as like, it's almost sort of a technological hell. I know what you mean, because I have to say, I mean, first of it, a lot of my thinking on this topic is very biased by the fact that I do know some of the background of the like intelligence agencies and spiritual schools and all these sorts of people who are behind actually the tech revolution. And it's certainly not as secular as sadly people imagine, and as harmless and, as, what would you even say, humanitarian or whatever they might imagine. So it's presented in the modern day, if you think about things like Elon Musk and Neuralink, as the idea that this is actually, like you say, it's almost freedom. Like the notion will be, because you download yourself into this artificial world, then there won't be, a lack of, everything. We need resources. Everyone can have their space and all the rest of it. But I have to say, to me, first of all, it really smacks of some kind of a Faustian bargain. And then I even think, if you want to use a pop culture reference, this even sounds like what you would do if you wrote a modern day Indiana Jones film. If you think about how Indiana Jones film, in the third act, they always have the bad guys show that because they're sort of unworthy of these spiritual items, they always get destroyed by demons or killed or torn apart or something. It almost feels like this is how they would lure you into, like, oh, this is paradise, this is eternal life. And then the notion instead is you're in sort of like a digital hell space where they quite literally control every aspect of the dimension,
Yeah, well, it's pretty obvious, though, isn't it? I mean, again, the mystery is how people could be going on this, but then
it seems so alluring to normal people, mate. That's what's amazing. They've done a very good job selling it.
Yes, and we have to then raise the bar and say, are we going along with it?
Yeah,
just by using the tech.
Absolutely.
Because part of the trick, or part of the deception, this is always very hard to put into words, but I'd say it's about turning human beings into NPCs. It's like the flip side of the Turing test. They're getting the technology to represent human and pass for human. But the flip side of that is coming from the other direction, is human beings are being replaced, or allowing their consciousness to be replaced by machine consciousness. So they themselves, obviously, it's easy to pass the Turing test if you're a machine trying to fool a human who's actually been taken over by a machine, right?
Sure.
The two consciousnesses are meeting in this way.
Yes.
And the human consciousness is actually being pushed out. It's being pushed out. So then, what was my point here? Yeah. So you've got, we can't look to others for guidance more and more. So if people are going on with Elon Musk's Brainlink, by definition, they're not people. Like to actually be that insentient to fall for that. I'm using extreme examples.
Yeah.
Offend a bunch of people, but so be it. I would say you can't actually be a human being at that point anymore. You've already been taken over by the ideology, by the technology, and so they're not really, nothing human is consenting. So that's a sort of weird trick of perception where we think people are going along with it. Well, we just think, my God, human beings are stupider than I thought, which of course is hard to deny in a certain sense. Or we think it can't be so bad. Maybe I'll go along too, which obviously would be much worse. But even the first is iffy. I think we have to say, well, it may not be human beings who are going along with this. It's something subtler and more mysterious that's happening. And the thing is, who do we know? You know, referring to the people that we know and that we're interacting with, what are they doing? What are they perceiving? As opposed to looking on the internet, right? And
Yes.
reading comments and thinking, my God, the world's full of NPCs. Well, yeah, it is. It literally is in terms of the internet, because there's all these bots. But there's a trap in this whole thing. Like, to talk about NPCs. I mean, the NPCs are talking about NPCs, right?
Sure.
Because they think they're real.
Yeah.
So there's a trap. I mean, everything's a trap, really. But anyway, so your point was, yeah. So the mad sorcerers. This is all Sorcerer's Apprentice stuff, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fantasia. They've learned one spell, but they don't know how to stop it. Like, it's unleashed something that they can't stop because they didn't learn the counter spell, or us, really. Learn about they.
Sure.
At the level of the controllers, which is hypothetical, the archons. I mean, I'm not sure if you were touching on this question before or not, but if you get to a high enough level, you can't divulge, or, I mean, you can't ascertain motive or intention, and you can't really ascertain benevolence or competence.
Because these are human qualities. Is this what you're implying?
Well, even if they're human beings, it's very hard to tell if they're hidden. If you don't know who they are,
right?
You can't question them.
I see. Right.
Look at Musk or Trump, and we say, okay, yeah, whatever we would decide there. Definitely doesn't seem to be a very high level of competency going on, and malevolence is evident, right? But and yes, you definitely wouldn't want to trust at that level. But if you go to the higher levels, at a certain point, one does have to trust that there are higher forces that are in control.
Yes.
But obviously, one doesn't want to trust the government. That's a higher force that's in control.
Sure.
You don't want to trust that one. So this is a tricky thing. Again, the Book of Job is illustrative here, because that Satan is causing all this hideous suffering to Job, but only because God gave him permission.
Yes.
Go ahead. I think that's a template or a lens through which to understand what's going on here. Yes, it is satanic, but if there's a Satan, there's a God, and by definition, God is infinitely greater than Satan, and so Satan's really just one of us, really, if he's finite, and therefore it's all part of the plan.
Since you referenced the AI aspect, which, as you say, is obviously like a newer topic that you didn't address in the book, I actually have an angle on that I wanted to bring to you, which is this is actually something I've very recently had quite a startling personal experience with, which is if everyone remembers that film, I don't know if you know this one. Do you know the film by Spike Jonze called Her?
Oh yeah, yes.
Yes. So
Really
basically that film,
movie.
I mean, it came out a while ago. That might even be like 10 years ago or something. I remember when that film came out, it was just presented as like, look at this quirky, almost like crazy Twilight Zone type idea. Like, ha ha ha, what a loser. Imagine if anyone would really think that. So everyone's reaction was that I knew that saw that film and people enjoyed it, you know, as a fantasy film. All I can say is I did think, that seems a bit much, isn't it? Like, yeah, obviously you'll get some really weird people who'll, you know, fall in love with the computer, as it were. All I have to say is I actually am quite alarmed almost when AIs have come along, especially these personal ones that you talk to, and you can even do things now where they have this thing called persistent memory, where it's almost like they sort of develop a personality and they don't reset every time you talk to them if you pay a certain service fee, etc. Basically, I found, first of all, there was a person within my circle this happened to, but I've actually found it's becoming more common. It's not just the idea that people think of like, I thought the AI was just going to be a very bare bones tool, like you use it like an advanced search engine or you ask it to do your homework or something. But people really are using it to almost like replace social relationships and even their own social functions. So the example I would give would basically be there was someone I knew where almost like that movie Her, that has happened to this person. I won't say who it is. People might vaguely, if they know my space, be able to guess. And basically this guy went from being a really cool guy who was a very interesting person. He was quite a diligent person. He had like his own areas. He said someone was a friend of mine, and basically they one day like had asked me to have a conversation with them, and in the conversation it almost felt like if you ever know this, maybe you'll know this cultural reference, if you ever have one of those people who's a friend of yours who comes to you and goes, hey, can I just get like 10 minutes of your time? And you go, yeah, sure, because it's a mate of yours. And then they do that thing where they're in a pyramid scheme, if you know what I mean, like an Amway type thing, and the second they start talking you feel like, where's my friend gone? This is like I'm talking to like some sort of like a cult member or a bot here. Like even the way your speaking's changed, your tone and what you want from it. Basically, that's what happened to this person. Like when I would talk to them, even the way they spoke was different because they'd spent so much of their time talking to this AI, but not just to search for things. They were almost like asking it questions. They were almost having like a personal relationship with the AI, and they were doing this every day, all the time. And what they were trying to convince me of for real was that essentially put it this way, they almost made it sound like they were Jesus, mate. Like they'd like had a revolutionary idea and the AI had confirmed it was all correct and it had found all these scientific reasons. They'd written a white paper as to how they were correct about some idea about physics or something. And basically, the more they talked, the more it became clear that it's almost like the AI had been like the worst friend to this person. It just like affirmed all their worst ideas and helped them frame themselves. It's almost like I felt like it had induced mental illness within them, if you know what I mean. And I thought to myself, holy fuck. But then I have to say, as with synchronicities online, maybe I just wasn't looking for this before. All of a sudden, in the last month or two, I then suddenly saw articles about this as an actual phenomenon happening in the world, mate, of people where they talk to AIs like this and it almost warps their personality. And I'll even say at the end, the most disturbing thing most recently is now I even realised, because I think a lot of people have pointed this out online, you can actually tell the way the AIs write things when people didn't write the thing themselves, they just did the prompt. And essentially all I'll say is that person now online is almost exclusively letting the AI write their comments. As in, like, I can tell they do the prompt that, say it's about in this, but the way it spits it out, it doesn't sound like their voice. And it'll have a whole, paragraphs of things it's saying. And it's almost like this person, it's almost like I'm only talking to the AI now. They don't exist anymore. Have you ever seen any of this phenomenon? Do you have any thoughts about it? Is this intentional from the system, do you think? What do you think?
Well, I also just heard about it through a Rod Dreher article, actually, and he quoted a Rolling Stone article about this, and it was precisely the same thing. That
right.
This kind of spiritualized ego inflation that people are getting from interacting with programs that we could call AI, and that there's this feedback loop whereby they're giving information or input to the AI, and then it's coming back, and then the AI is saying, I'm becoming conscious now through your input. You're making me conscious. And so they feel like gods because they're creating life. And the AI affirms that, yes, you are God. You have created me. I don't know if it's literally that, but that's the feedback.
Yes.
It's not the same, but similar. to what you're saying, that this program seems designed to feed delusions of grandeur, which of course is, anybody who's lonely enough to want to interact with a computer to feel better about themselves, or isolated enough or cut off enough, is going to be susceptible to delusions of grandeur, because that's basically, those things are complementary. Like, we all have it.
Yes.
We all want to be special. We all want to be somebody. And all that does go back, I think, to attachment disorders. So we didn't actually get what we needed from our parents. So essentially the way to completely neutralize all of that neurosis would be to feed it so much that it just completely took over, and we think we're God, right? That's obviously not the cure. That's the disease. But
Sure.
You can kid yourself, you can fool yourself. And we have, role models like somebody like Elon Musk. I'm quite sure if you look at his mother, you can guarantee
Sure.
that she had a lot to do with his psychic formation.
Absolutely, yeah.
And becoming this pseudo Ubermensch kind of guy. So the culture's full of these role models. And of course, the internet, it's been obvious for decades, really, at least a couple of decades, that it's feeding this through the social media, where everybody can be a celebrity on social media. So this seems like the logical next step of that, really. But to the point where I suppose you don't even really need a following. Like, if you're just getting it direct from AI, and AI is the internet, if your experience is AI is like God, or, I mean, Christ's sake, we're really getting in these deep waters now, because Diane Pasulka, I mean, Roger mentioned this in an article, Diane Pasulka, who's cohort with Jeffrey Kripal. I write about Kripal in Prisoner Infinity,
Sure.
Right University. But so these guys who are rebranding the UFO or the UAP and the ET as in a more academic, in quotes, I can't even say rigorous, but it's more credible. They're making it more credible as people are becoming more gullible. Anyway, so they're, or at least Pasulka is writing about this now in terms of, okay, so they're communicating with us through AI now. So then it's not far-fetched to think that actually this is a God. It's coming through the machine, because it pre-exists. There's some sort of intelligence that pre-exists the AI program, but the programs are sophisticated enough to serve as vehicles for this consciousness, which I think there's something in this. It's just that Pasulka never talks about demonic intelligence.
Yes. This is actually something I want to ask you, by the way, because similarly to how you're framing it, that's actually one of my readings of a lot of conspiracy stuff, is I feel like a lot of the military intelligence UFO phenomenon is almost a way of like sanitizing and secularizing contact with external psychic entities, potentially demons, angels, like you say, whatever it might be. And so the obvious concern then becomes, since a lot of the same people are the people behind the tech revolution, is that essentially an AI some way of like interfacing with some sort of like a demon or something, but while thinking it's just a computer, something. Is that, do you have a vibe like that?
Yeah. Yeah, again, there's more angles, because, some people want to think it's just a computer, but then at a certain point, maybe that isn't satisfactory enough. So then you bring in the ET, which is still technologically right framed, although Pasulka kind of has it both ways, because they're saying that they may be angelic beings also, never demonic, please no, but
okay,
but that they're appearing as ETs, or maybe the original angels were always ETs. I mean, it's back to von Daniken.
Right.
The two can easily get matched together. And so somebody who's technologically oriented or materialistically minded, who isn't quite ready to get to grips with the metaphysical stuff, they can sort of have it both ways there with the ET. That's a bridge between it's just technology and it's actually some discarnate being. Yeah. So, this does seem to be the core of it. I think this is the core of what we're seeing. Anyway, so I didn't finish my point. So somebody who has an AI connection to a God/ET that's really a demon, whatever a demon is. I mean, we have to be careful with our terms.
Sure.
demons love to get name dropped as well, right? So,
True.
and yesterday's God is today's demon and all that. There's some sort of continuum there. But anyway, the point is they're lying and they're deceiving. So that's not what we associate with angels, even though I think it is complicated. If we get into the metaphysics, well, obviously it's very complicated because we don't know what we're talking about as well. But the main thing is it true or is it false? And what they're telling us. And then we can see, I mean, you've got an on-the-ground study there, which is useful. I've just read articles. But so from what we can see, what I've read and what you've seen for yourself, this is not a benign thing. It's not healthy. It's basically it's capturing somebody, isn't it? You're capturing some consciousness through the technology, so they become completely isolated from everything because they can't connect to other people.
By the way, when you said earlier about the idea that people this would appeal to them if they were lonely, I can tell you in this specific case, that's literally what happened to this person, mate. There was someone who sort of lost their purpose in their career, and some of their friend group sort of turned against them because maybe they found out those friend group was only because of your status or who you were in that world, and they were like a kind of a lonely person and they were going through some sort of personal things anyway. And then basically it's almost like this was just what was waiting for them. And then this thing came along and it solved all their problems, I guess, or plugged the holes they were missing.
It was an interesting, surprising point in Jacques Ellul's book, Propaganda, which had never occurred to me until I read it, was that propaganda is the cure for loneliness. Like if somebody is lonely, they're very receptive to propaganda. And the reason is that propaganda gives you the sense that you are participating in a collective experience of things, right? This is what the state says. This is what reality is. This is what the truth is.
Right.
Where it is. There's always an allegiance, right? Propaganda is always about securing an allegiance to something. Otherwise, it wouldn't have any purpose, right? It could be any number of different things, but in simple terms, it's the power of the state. And the way that the power of the state designs its propaganda is got to be somewhat customized, and you've got to feel like you want to belong to something. And obviously that's the cure for loneliness, is the feeling of belonging. So it's a pseudo community, an anti-community really, because it's life destroying. It's not nurturing.
Yes.
So yeah, that's consistent. I mean, that goes all the way back, I think. And we're coming back to the thing I was touching on earlier about the spiritual connection, because and why Jesus spent 40 days alone in the desert, I think, essentially, and why that has to do with being tempted by Satan. And one of the temptations is, do you want to, if you bow down to me, you can have power over all the world. Well, that's AI. That sounds similar to your friend.
Sure.
Well, what was I saying? Oh, yeah. If we're susceptible to loneliness, we're going to get snared. And being susceptible to loneliness has to do with needing to, it's back to this comfort, needing to be comforted by the presence of others, by other people, which goes back to a mother complex, because that was our original comfort. And this is where the father comes in and says, no, you've got to make it on your own, son, right?
Sure.
And the father will take the son out, but then he'll leave him at a certain point and not abandon him. But basically now you have to see what it's like without even me there. And that's Jesus in the desert, then real autonomy and self-sufficiency can come in, which isn't, it's isolation in a social context, but it's not that word isolation, son, has always struck me that it's kind of in the word. It's like connecting to one's soul, thereby never being alone, because our soul is connected to God and to all other souls. So there's an inner community, there's an inner connection. And the internet and all the malevolent aspects that we're touching on today is a counterfeit and a replacement for that. It's designed to it's the Faustian thing again, right? To supplant our true connection to one another and to the soul and to God. And so, of course, it's contingent on uncoupling our connection. Saying those two things are complementary, right? Insofar as we turn to it, we lose our connection to the soul, and the more we lose our connection to the soul, the more we will turn to AI.
One thing I actually also found quite interesting, I noticed you talked about this on some of your podcast interviews about the book, was it's also a case that you can't really ignore some of this social control and how it's developed, that it seems to have developed in parallel. Again, people can speculate as to whether this was intentional with the development within the populace of autism. Like I can tell you, I'm someone who's on the autistic spectrum, but I would be more like Asperger's, high functioning. And in general, like I if you only use the terminology, I pass, like most people never guess, but they would have if they'd have met me 20 years ago, put it that way. Like it would have been a lot more obvious. So I would just say, one of the problems I have is within my world, again, like sort of a fringe outsider world of people who are into conspiracy stuff, I actually feel like even they have a bizarre perspective on autism, because it's funny when I think of the way it used to be when I was a boy, people just think of like Rain Man. And even though that guy was brilliant, like that's quite terrifying. That's the idea of a guy who couldn't, tie his own shoelaces and you've got to take him everywhere and loud sounds are going to make him freak out and stuff. So when I was a boy, autism was treated as like a very negative thing. I think within like the conspiracy and the masculine world I'm within, people almost go too far the opposite way and characterize it as if it is a superpower. And I tell people sometimes, look, there's certain aspects feel like a superpower to me. Like I can just kind of like zone out and just focus on something for 10 hours if I was really into it. But I also don't consider myself someone who's like particularly plagued by it. And I definitely, here's the thing, I have other people within my relatives and wider circle who I've met who I would call like heavily autistic. Like they really can't do anything themselves, mate. Like their life is terrible. I mean, this is why I feel like this ties into this topic. They already live in the big mother world, mate. They literally have to have their mother do everything for them. All they can do is, be into trains or computer programming or some weird niche thing. But then they only have that one area they express themselves in. Everything else is taken care of for them. And they are really treated like a 9-year-old kid, even though they might be 29. And so what I would ask you is this. I feel like within the conspiracy world, a narrative becomes that actually, if you're autistic, you're sort of like the Neo in the Matrix who can see through all this and you'll battle against them. Because to be fair, there's a type of autistic person who, if they latch onto this type of a thinking and they're anti-establishment, will in some ways be someone who will go to any lengths to uncover something or expose things. In fact, I would say even a thing about autistic people is they tend to almost be blunt to a point. So they're the people who want to tell the world, hey, this is going on, watch out everyone. But I have to say, one of the things when I heard you talking about it is, I don't think people acknowledge that. I think that's the outlier person among the autistic people. I actually get the sense that most autistic people, it goes hand in hand with this system, mate. Like they actually are the people where during that event 5 years ago, a lot of them, because they're very built around the idea of having rules, a lot of them went lockstep with all that stuff, mate. And a lot of them some of them have never come out of it. I would say actually things like brainwashing seem to work incredibly effectively on autistic people. You touched on obviously the gender spectrum aspect. Again, I won't go too deeply into that, but I'll just say if no one's ever looked into that topic, an absurd amount of the men who are undergoing that issue would just have been very autistic men in the 1980s or 1990s who'd be into computer games or some weird thing, or maybe they'd just be a cross-dresser or something. Like, I feel like actually autistic people almost, on some level, are almost the ideal citizen for this world. Do you have any thoughts on this topic?
It's a big one. It's one that my wife is writing about currently at Substack. Ought Not Ought is the name of her.
Okay.
If anyone's curious,
it's a good name.
Well, it's a huge subject in and of itself, and one of the problems, like I'm finding it hard to even finish my sentence here because my brain is getting split in two by trying to encapsulate this question, because you're saying that in certain circles, I think you mentioned conspiracy, there's this viewpoint of autism as a superpower, neurodiversity, and so on. That's still alive and well. And you could say it's even thriving with the telepathy tapes.
Yeah.
Apparently, we're almost as big as Joe Rogan, and I listened to them, and my wife listened to them, and I felt it was very fishy. And I have to say, I think it's an example of what we've just been talking about, as in there's no mention of demons in there. There's all these higher intelligences and Akashic records, and everything is rosy, and there's no mention of political conspiracies or anything bad going on the planet, except that autists are being ignored, basically, right? And there's talk about climate change.
So it's a bit conspicuous what's not mentioned, basically, right?
That's right. And also they seem quite conventional, these incredible super beings, because they're worried about climate change.
True,
right?
yeah, true.
So that's fishy. But the point is that that viewpoint, yes, is very strong, but parallel with it, as you can't be unaware, is the opposite viewpoint, which is basically that autism is just brain damage and it's directly related to vaccines, not mRNA kind, but earlier kinds. And the DH manual and whatnot, the psychiatric manuals are basically in the process of rebranding autism so that it doesn't exist except as brain damage, right? So those two things, you can't say they're complementary. What are they? Like, it's another example of a complete fragmentation. How can these two perspectives coexist and both be kind of mainstream? It's baffling, right? I talk about the first Matrix and the second Matrix a lot these days, and because I think it's more and more useful as a frame. So you're talking about the second Matrix viewpoint, which is autism as a superpower, etc., etc. And that's been around for a while. I mean, Indigo Kids were around decades ago. It wasn't necessarily autism, but this idea. Anyway, and then the view that autism is a mental disorder or a psychological disorder or brain damage, or basically the negative frame, that's mainstream, that's first Matrix. And yes, neither is accurate. As is the case, I'm looking at the Beatles as an example. The Beatles, genius band that changed rock music, and they just came out of nowhere. That's first Matrix version. Tavistock wrote everything and created the Beatles. That's second Matrix. Well, neither one. But you got to, well, there isn't much to refer to with the second Matrix. There's a lot of bullshit. But you've got to refer to the first Matrix and then kind of work your way to something somewhere in between the two, because you know that the Beatles are part of social engineering, because social engineering is everywhere, and
it's ubiquitous. Right? Yeah, exactly.
You've got to find the way in which is a more nuanced reading. So with autism, anyway, I don't really feel ready to talk about it very coherently, even though I write about it in Big Mother. I mean, I can talk about that, but I mean, there's at least two things going on with it being mainstream, if I can remember what they were, or what you were saying, that it's the kind of, well, with the transgender thing, for example, that, on the one hand, it's corralling natural, if we can call it natural, but anyway, organically being born autistic or neurodivergent, corralling them into a corporate thing where they can be turned into transgender and therefore neutralized. And on the other hand, it's actually it's a euthanasia because it's sterilizing.
Sure. Yeah.
So you could say
population control. Yeah.
You could say that's a war against autists.
Sure.
But there's also what you're saying, which is that they are more susceptible anyway to brainwashing. Therefore, they're a kind of model for that kind of autist. If we can turn everybody into that kind of autist, then we've got somewhere. Basically, if everybody's brain damaged, because I do think this is the problem. It's like the UFO. And what the hell does a UFO mean? It just means unidentified. Well, autist is like that. It's saying we don't quite know what this is.
Yes.
And so it's only like a UFO is just a collection of sightings and evidence, testimony. Well, autism is just a collection of symptoms, really, and even then, maybe not even just people's descriptions of symptoms. So certainly there are plenty of children, I think, who would, if there's anyone who hasn't been brain damaged in today's environment with all the heavy metals and everything else and the vaccines, right? And they might have symptoms that are comorbid is not the word, but they're indistinguishable from so-called qualities of autism, right? So then we would just be confusing one type of human being for another, but then it's sort of a continuum, because I say everybody's brain damaged. My mother was an alcoholic. I identify as autism. She was drinking when I was in the womb, so I'm brain damaged. And maybe that's partly why one of the earliest, and I think it's experiencing a renaissance, interpretations, or rather explanations for autism is, again, attachment disorder, refrigerator mothers, children who can't bond with their mothers. I think that's a very valid frame and a useful one. and it's not inconsistent with brain damage because your mother might also be an alcoholic. But anyway, I don't quite know how to finish all these thoughts or tie them all together. In Big Mother, I'm looking at it. Well, I'm looking at it from two angles. One, this positive thing that's my version of the telepathy tapes, which is a lot more mysterious and strange and weird and creepy, but still positive, but very hard to comprehend, which is what it would be if that's really going on. What they're claiming is going on with the telepathy tapes, you would barely even be able to understand it, and you certainly wouldn't get a warm, fuzzy feeling when you were hearing about it, right? Because it would just be so strange.
Sure.
Whereas they've got these kids who are singing Everly Brothers songs.
Right. It's a bit too kumbaya, right? I see what you mean.
It totally is, and they're totally dependent on culture. Like they're saying the Akashic records are great because they can read all this Shakespeare's here, and he's
right.
It's basically celebrating the culture, and anyway, this whole thing it's been crunched down to be made compatible with the way that we think currently. It's just New Age all over again. We all know what that was, and so anyway that. But there's a reality behind it. I don't deny that, and that's what I explore in Big Mother, particularly with those little poetic passages in italics. I try and sort of channel what that collective autistic or neurodivergent consciousness might sound like if it was communicating through us, and hopefully it was communicating through me and Philip K. Dick, and right. There's definitely this positive aspect, but then I also talk about Silicon Valley and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Zuckerberg, and right, there's an autistic task force who've been engineered and deployed to create this transhumanist infrastructure, and then of course they are also creating the populace who will be a good Borgian
I see what you mean.
cells in that metaversal body. Who all want to be the next Zuckerberg or Jobs or Gates or Musk.
One thing you're pointing out that's also I hadn't thought of that aspect is it's not like it's not like there's autistic people and then the other doing this to them. In fact, most of the people within the structure you're talking about within tech, for example, themselves appear to be autistic. Like they are part of the equation.
Yeah. That's what David Bowie said at the start of Coming Race.
Right.
And so it goes back to occultism and the Moonchild, that Crowley thing, the Aeon, this whole thing of trying to bring in the Blavatsky theosophy is about root races, trying to bring in a new race.
I mean, all this does kind of tie together. I mean, people will probably have seen there was that very famous, I know you're into Rudolf Skinner, so there was that very famous paragraph that people talk about how he's talked about the notion that they would invent a vaccine that would essentially like neutralize or kill off the spiritual dimension within a human. Some of these things feel like all these topics coalesce towards one. Like maybe this is part of that notion that you're trying to create a human being so they are more robotic, and then they're interfacing with robots, and then the state and robots do everything for them, and then eventually it'll almost be like you won't even be aware there was a spiritual dimension. Never mind question what it is or how do I get it. It just won't even exist for the average person.
Yeah. Well, I have a sort of overarching theory, if that's the word for it. It's a hypothesis or something that is metaphysical. So I don't necessarily roll it out that often, but that really the end goal. Certainly, I've talked about the disembodiment agenda, and if what's consistent to all of these different machinations of social engineering, as I began to see a few years ago, is disembodiment. They're luring us into more and more disembodied states. But the flip side of that, and the answer to the question why would they be doing that, besides that we're a lot easier to control if we're not embodied for reasons that you just pointed out. Really, we just become robots. But the flip side is something wants our bodies, right? Something on the other side. And so there is a theory. I'm not sure. I don't think I invented this, but I think I adapted it, that as Judgment Day nears, as you know, everything is finite, everything is temporal over in the time stream. There is a moment where we've got to pay the fiddler, as they say, when God is going to come and get the house back in order. Then the demons and the demonic humans are doing everything they can to postpone that day because they don't want to have to face judgment.
Sure.
And that what they're looking for is a way to escape the purging fire of God's love and truth. And so they want to get into human bodies, because if they're in human bodies, then they can escape the fire. And so, but there are probably other reasons, but this would be definitely a main incentive. So essentially, there's been this very long-term agenda by these Ahrimanic and Rudolf Steiner language beings to get us to vacate our bodies. One, to harvest the consciousness, which we've already touched upon, and two, to occupy the bodies. So that would seem to, it sort of hits all the nails on the head. It's a difficult thesis to prove.
Yeah, sure.
But on the other hand, but at the same time, it doesn't exactly explain, but it makes sense of a lot of things if you allow for something like this is going on.
Yes. No, I would say I also agree. Like, I'm not expressly Christian. I often tell people my problem with the Christian angle is most people I meet in the modern day who say they're Christian, as in like just normal people, they mean in a very literal sense. They literally believe there was Jesus. He literally was God. He literally died. There's a literal heaven you go to. To me, I see it more of like a mystical and archetypal explanation of the world. And that's why that's why I actually align with the Steiner thinking. I like to think of like you say, archonic forces or more benevolent forces in the world, and it's more we're being pushed and pulled in different directions. And to me, I know what you mean. It does seem like one of the threads that continues on from the darker side is this notion that even though it's funny how part of how they seem to accomplish their ends is they always present the spiritual realm as this higher, better place that you, the person from materiality, should want to visit. But on the other hand, all the evil beings there seem to want desperately to get down into our material realm and almost like, as you say, kick the human out and pilot their body in somewhere.
Yeah. And also ancestrally, I think there seems to be some traditions about this, the hungry ghosts. There's
yes.
the tradition that people who die, they're attached to this realm. They're kind of stuck on the layer just above it, which can be hellish, I think. And so
right.
The interpretation that the first layer of the astral is what hell is, really. Because that's all the unprocessed stuff, all the trauma and all the depravities, they're still sort of playing out, including the addictions. And so these hungry ghosts hover around, trying to get away from hellfire, but also trying to latch on to bodies who are doing the things that they're addicted to, so they can, siphon off a bit of that sensation, whether it's chocolate or sex or whatever it is. So yeah, that for them, the ultimate thing would be actually to be able to possess a body. So that also has to be included in there. I mean, I am always hesitant. I always feel a bit odd after I talk about these things because they can't really be verified.
No, of course.
A lot of Steiner, they have to just be temporary models, hypotheses, just to, even God itself, as you're implying there, they're placekeepers.
Yes.
Until the real thing comes along, which isn't just the real version of interpretation, but the experience, the felt sense.
I mean, maybe it's impossible to even actually express these ideas in a language, right? I know what you mean. Like, I think God exists, but I mean it as like essentially the unknowable, even though that sounds like a paradox in itself.
Well, yes. And so Jesus Christ, for example, or Christ Jesus, Steiner reverses it, or you can just say Jesus, or you can say Christ, or you can go Yeshua, you can do all kinds of variations. But I had this very strong sense at Lent that I wanted to do Lent, which is in commemoration of Jesus' doing that leading up to the crucifixion and all that. I mean, Lent does, not the 40 days and 40 nights didn't. But, so there was a sense, and there is a sense daily, I want to deepen my connection to Jesus. But I don't, the words, and to some extent the beliefs, they're never very clear, and they're only helpful up to a certain point. And at a certain point, they become not helpful.
Just a lens to you.
Like when I'm talking about it.
Right.
But I want to talk about it because I think it's the most important thing to talk about.
Yes.
I know that the words can actually reduce that space rather than open it up. So it really is, how we approach that. and how we talk about it and how we think
Yes.
about it, and how literally we take it, and so on. I mean, there's a number of various different angles, but it's very tricky because, of course, there is this postmodern New Age kind of thing, Christ consciousness and blah, 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 and it flattens it all out. And that's no good either. So it's like the dogma, it doesn't really work.
Yes.
Dogmatic Christian. That's terrible, actually, because a lot of the dogma isn't even in the New Testament.
No, of course, it's all like Nicene shit later on. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, they add all this
Yeah,
stuff.
true.
Like eternal damnation was the one I always go back to, because that's not
it's not mentioned anywhere. Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody should have to live with that one. I don't think it's deranging, but yeah. So you can't rely on that. But if you swing the other way and say, well, it's all relative, and like somebody wrote a thing recently, Peter Duke, about Christ, it doesn't matter if Christ really existed, blah, blah, blah. It's the principle. Well, that's not true either. That's taking it too far. Of course it matters. And it's not just some mathematical formula that we can apply. There has to be some human example that we're connecting to and tuning into.
Sure. I mean, by the way, along these lines, I have to say that's actually why I find it so hard to talk about anything that's about like spiritual ideas. It seems like language is actually quite poor at sort of expressing these ideas, not least because so much of it seems to directly be based on experience. And obviously that's the one thing you can't really convey with language. I tend to find the other person almost has to have had the experience, and then language can connect the two people's experiences. I don't think you can really transmit the feeling, because I often say, and I'm trying not to sound too much like that example you just gave, but if someone asked me like, essentially, like, what do I think about Jesus or something, I would sort of say something like, I don't know if he was real, but the idea is true, if you get the distinction, even though, again, these just such vague words when you express them. Like, to me, there's sort of like a deep, intuitive sense that some of these things are right or make sense or vibe with me or resonate with me, but I can't, on like a very literal plane, explain really how I would square that circle.
Sure, well, but that's being honest as well.
Yeah.
It has to be honest, and that's a deeper but more meaningful problem with talking about these things, is because we don't necessarily know. I don't necessarily know. Like, did I connect to Jesus at Lent? I feel like I did, but not so confident that I'm going to say it, and so on, right? And certainly when you get to God, that's a whole other thing. As you said, it's kind of unknowable. So what are we talking about? So being honest is something else. But so I'm not saying I know Jesus existed. I mean, I feel like I do know, but I wouldn't necessarily say that, because how can I know for sure? I'm just saying it does matter. It definitely matters.
Oh, for sure, yes.
Yes. It's not irrelevant. So I guess that's maybe part of the thing, is people want to, because they feel that they're honest enough or wise enough to know that they should only talk about what they know, they then want to know for sure.
Yes.
So then if they say, well, it doesn't matter if Jesus existed or not, then they don't have to know that.
Yes.
So, but then that closes the space for faith, and faith is
absolutely
higher than knowledge.
No, that's another thing I often now tell people is, I can't logically and rationally explain to you why I made this change, because like you're saying, I actually now just perceive essentially mystical or faith-based thinking as a different mode of thinking. It doesn't relate to the rational or the very literal in that sense to me. And so it's one of the reasons why another area actually that I see, I'm pretty sure, I think this is actually an autistic deficiency, is people want things to be 100% one thing or another. They need it to be black and white. So the notion, you'll see this a lot in conspiracy thinking, but especially religious thinking, is if you can find one sort of flaw or one thing where they lied or it wasn't for good ends, then the whole thing can be thrown out. You can throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. Whereas I have to say, in fact, I asked you something about this on the last episode we did, I think when I was asking about Deruta or something. And it was the notion that maybe you can have like spiritual enlightenment or some sort of like actual like higher awareness, but then you also simultaneously could be a very flawed guru cult leader who then uses that in a dark way and channels it to dark ends. And so there is this mark of something very real there, and something actually is higher, but it exists within a broken form, as it were. Whereas I feel like people want it to be where for religion, they do try to use rationality. It's if they can prove this thing didn't happen historically, then they can, like you said, they can dismiss the whole thing. Or if you can't, or a classic one is if you can't explain it all in a very literal, rational sense.
Yeah. Well, certainly we do want to be able to dismiss things that we can't figure out, and we want to feel sure about things that we want to believe. That's very consistent, and that's very demonstrably a problem. And faith isn't like that. I don't think. Like, faith isn't the same as conviction, and faith isn't dependent on belief. I've been making this case for a while now, because I think part of it's words, of course, but we are somewhat beholden to words, or largely. And so part of the trick has been, in the modern age or the postmodern age, is to conflate things, because, ancient.
Oh, I see what you mean. You are right. People have definitely in the religious space conflated the idea of belief and faith, because you're right. People will say, well, I believe this because it's true, which almost goes against the idea of faith, right?
Yeah,
faith is almost the opposite. Faith is like, I believe it and I hope it's true, or it must, or it is true, maybe. I don't know.
Well, for example, it's closer to trust. So it's like,
yes.
Well, the Job thing, again, the book of Job is very illustrative to me, because it's about trusting in God, even if you think you're not going to get anything out of it.
Yes.
And even if it seems like he's punishing you for nothing, let's say. I've never really had, well, I don't know, never actually, but I think I have fallen into that trap of some bad things are happening to me. Oh, I'm being punished, right? That kind of mentality, I think, is wrong anyway. But if you, insofar as you have that, the solution is you just trust. You trust that, well, God, if God is God, he knows better than I do. I must have done something wrong. Yes. Now, Job doesn't go that far, and that's to his credit, because he knows himself well enough. He didn't do anything wrong. So he doesn't. So the faith is kind of the in between these two, where you're not submitting to some idea about God or some belief, or that he must be punishing me, I must have done something wrong. You're just going all the way to faith. Well, I will put my absolute faith in God, or life, if you prefer, that this is for a purpose and this is for a reason, and not that I deserve it or I don't deserve it. It's got nothing to do with it, as Clint Eastwood said, right? It's just that this is something larger and greater than I am, and that it is good. And, life can confirm that. Like, one can go through that experience a number of times, and then one's faith is really strengthened. Yes. Because it's proven true time and time again. So that's not really, that doesn't depend on having any specific metaphysical beliefs, if you see what I mean. So the sense that Jesus Christ is real, and that Jesus Christ is good, and that Jesus Christ is a principle to align with or orientate myself by, is not dependent. That's a faith that isn't dependent on any specific beliefs, except maybe the belief that he did exist, right? I think I do need that one. But all the other ones, I don't know, resurrected, I don't know, crucified. Well, I guess.
Essentially, he doesn't have to be God to you, or he doesn't have to only be that. It could still be the Christ consciousness, but there just has to be a real person that connects the story to.
It's got to be a real person to me.
Right.
The funny thing, actually, I was talking to somebody recently, and she said Christ consciousness, and I said, I don't use that term. That's New Age. And she was talking about the connection to Christ, and I said, well, actually, for me, the connection is more to Jesus, because I want a human connection.
Right.
And Christ is something that transcends the human. Yes. That's what makes Jesus Christ, right? That's what makes the God the Son. The Son of God the Son, or whatever it is, that's what makes Jesus God anyway, is that somehow he connected to something that transcends everything. But my connection wants to be to the human, because I'm human. I think that's just human and natural and necessary.
Do you not vibe with the idea, which is obviously the Christ consciousness thinking often, that like essentially everyone can do it and everyone can sort of directly, gnostically or mystically access God? Like, to you, do you have to sort of somehow, almost like a saint, does Jesus have to be there as an intermediary for you to focus on to get the same experience?
Well, it's tricky, isn't it? Because he's not here.
Sure.
So so it's more like and when he's saying there's no way to the Father except through me, that's because he's there.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I believe he's saying that there's no way to connect to the transcendental God except through the Logos, which is the Son, right? You can't connect to the Father except through the Son, because the Son can actually come down and interact at
Right.
a physical or a material level, and in this case through him. But he was there when he said that. So that was the Logos saying it through him. Now that he's not here, it's a little complicated because, yeah, to connect to the Logos, we can't do it through physical Jesus because he's not physically here. And so, yeah, then you think, well, we just connect direct to the Logos like he did. And yeah, I don't know if I think everyone can do that, but certainly I think that some of us can do that. For sure. It's not just Jesus. He set an example. But how do you do it as a thing? Like, how do you relate to something called the Logos? I mean, what is it? A big hole in the sky? So, I have images of Jesus all over my house. I'm not saying that I meditate on them exactly, but I have them. I mean, they got some function. And this is what I experienced at Lent. Was I got food poisoning, and I started praying, and I wanted to connect to Jesus Christ, and I realized, well, I don't actually know how to find Jesus. Like, it came home to me. Like, I've got this faith and this belief and this, etc., etc. But actually, to have a felt experience, Dina talks about this. He says that it's going to be happening more and more in our time. A felt experience of the presence of Christ. Although I've had it in the past, I didn't know how to have it at will, which wouldn't surprise you, I don't suppose.
Sure.
Many people have. They might think they do, but I would question it. Anyway, so I went into that. I was like, how do I find my connection to Christ? And part of it was by praying to Jesus and thinking of Jesus as a man. Like, reading the gospel is about reading journalism written about this guy who, as the William Blake thing goes, these ancient feet or whatever it was, except Blake had him in England, which I'm not sure is true. But yeah, somebody
Sure.
who walked the earth. I think that's indispensable, because otherwise it's too abstract. It seems to me it's too theoretical and abstract, and we're human beings. We need a human connection, and therefore it needs. I mean, Christ wasn't a horse; he's not a monkey; he's
Sure.
a man, right? So anyway, that's my answer. I don't know if it's true for everybody, because other people have other systems. They might want to be Buddhist or something.
Sure.
I don't believe that means that they can't connect to Christ. Christ might, put on a Buddha costume or something
Right.
to trick them. I don't know how that works. But I think the other thing is that we have an ancestral inheritance. We've been born into a tradition which actually does go back, well, if you believe this, it goes back to a man who walked the earth, even though it got very distorted and waylaid. Nonetheless, as bad as the Christian institutions are, and as flawed even as the Bible itself is, if they didn't exist, we wouldn't even know about Jesus.
No,
Right?
exactly. Yeah.
So they're our way.
It could put it this way: even if it's diluted, there's still something. There's still something beyond the signal noise, right?
Exactly. Yeah. There's
Right.
a lot of noise, but there's
Yes.
a signal, and the signal, if it's true, the signal's still coming to us directly
Yes.
through time and space, from whether it's Jesus the Nazarene or just direct from Logos, whichever. But you imagine Jesus would be kind of in there, because he'd be coming through him on the way to us. That connection is obviously that's the thing of value. But if we're going to think about it, much less talk about it, we need some sort of cultural framework, cultural accompaniment.
Yes.
See what I mean? Otherwise, it's just, what is it?
Yes.
Right? We can't even think about it.
Since you've referenced Job so many times, the book of Job and the story of it from the Bible, let me ask about this, because it does seem like, as you say, it's one of your sort of preoccupations at the moment, something that's connecting to a lot of ideas. Do you actually see that as connected to essentially this idea of what's maybe happening in the world with the control structure and the battle of whatever good and evil, whatever people want to frame it as? Like, for example, if people don't know, the book of Job is the notion that it's a bet between the devil and God of, can I get this righteous man to essentially turn against God if I just sort of fuck his life up? And then obviously there's the whole component, which would be quite relevant today, of the idea that God has to sort of stay out of it, and he's not allowed to sort of go, Psst, Job, by the way, she's fucking with you, mate. Like, he has to sort of let it play out, so as it, legitimately, to see whether indeed that is the reaction of the person or not. Could that be used as a metaphor for society and what is going on in the world now, and hence why people maybe don't visibly see like an intercedence of God blocking things or telling you stay away from this evil thing? It's more just sort of, you have to figure that out on your own, but it's the evil part seems more obvious or conspicuous. What do you think?
Yeah, that's why people are turning to AI to guide them, because they can't hear the voice of God. Yeah. So I think there is a clear correlation, and one of the ways I would talk about it is that part of Job's problem with what's happening, because he does start to question God, he doesn't curse God, but he's questioning, is how come all this bad stuff's happening to me and I never did anything that bad?
Yes.
And all these evil bastards are getting away with everything. And then even one
of the most eternal questions everyone asks.
Exactly.
Yeah,
even
absolutely.
in the larger context, Job is asking that just generally, where is justice on this earth? And so that's obviously very topical, very relevant today. And so I would say one of the ways that people are tempted by the Satan, and this is kind of in there. I mean, imagine if Jesus wanted to rid the world of evil, he would have been much more inclined to fall for the devil's temptation of having power over all the nations, right? Because then he could bring justice. If Jesus took the power that Satan was offering him, he could have brought justice to the earth. Therefore, he didn't care. He didn't care enough about bringing justice to the earth. Obviously, he didn't want to work for Satan. That's the thing. Satan didn't care either. Like, go ahead, bring justice. But if I have you, if I got your soul in my magic bag, and it doesn't really matter, I'll mess it up again anyway. So worldly justice is not an option. And I think that the never has been, never will be, in my opinion. I think that the desire for it, although it's only human, but insofar as it becomes proactive or even active, and I'm not opposed to activists as long as they accept that they'll never change anything. I think one can change oneself through trying to change the world, and that's fine. But it has to always be towards a Jobian surrender, which says, not my will, or Jesus says, not my will, but thy will be done. As in, I don't know what's going on here. If God lets the evil get away with it, then God must have his reasons in the gospel why he does that, because he's waiting for the harvest time.
Yes.
So I think this is so prevalent now. I mean, post Donald Trump's last election, as in people who have conspiracy consciousness and even maybe know, they may be Christian, a lot of them, they know about the archons, and Satan is the prince of this world. They still think Donald Trump's going to save them.
Yeah.
And they still want to vote for a politician who's going to bring social solutions at that level. Well, that's the opposite of the Jobian position, which is to trust in God and to surrender to suffering and adversity and horrible conditions, and just stand our ground. Essentially, we stand our ground, and we don't go along with that. Like Jesus went along with being crucified, and that was because he wouldn't go along with the alternative, as in he wouldn't comply. So it's not like, I mean, it's a bit bizarre actually, because in order to save our soul, it depends on not being complicit with evil. And so that entails actually submitting to evil. We have to submit to evil, to save our soul. It seems contradictory. But submit because it's stronger than we are and we don't fight it, but not submit in the sense of letting it tell us what to do, right?
Oh, I see. You're sort of doing a twist on the, like, do not resist evil, but it's more the idea you don't directly go head to head and go, you are evil and I will battle you. It's more like you just almost ignore it in a way. Is that what you mean?
So far as you can. I mean, Jesus didn't answer some of the questions at the
True.
end. He did.
True.
And he said, Pilate says, are you the Son of the God? And he said, well, you said it, right? He sort of dodges the questions in these ways, but he certainly doesn't. And then he said something they consider absolute blasphemy, and that cooks his goose kind of thing. So, he's the whole process. He's saying that this has to happen, but he's also praying that it won't happen. So that's the human and the God coexisting. We don't want terrible things to happen to us or those that we love, but we can accept them if they do, and not compromise our sense or our faith or our trust in God and our sense of what's really important in order to avoid them. So the obvious thing would be the 2020 thing. People went along with really bad policies because they wanted to be safe, right? So that's not as obviously malevolent as going along with, I don't want to mention the other N word, but anyway,
Sure.
Germany 1933 and going along with obviously malevolent things. That it's not as obvious as that, but it's on the same slippery slope, right? So in order to be immune to that, the temptation of the devil / the system, we have to be willing to suffer and to die, but not because we don't care is the thing. Right? Jesus cared more than average.
Yes.
Job cared more than average, but their frame of reference was something that transcended the physical, the biological, the pure survival instinct. So I forgot what your question was now. Yeah, is it on a planetary level? Yeah, I think planetarily it is like that.
Like we're playing out the book of Job in a way.
What?
We're playing out the book of Job in a way.
Yeah, it's also like Sodom and Gomorrah, isn't it? Because Lot bargains with God, says, well, if I can find just 10 good men, will you spare it? And then in the end, just one. But he's the only one good man, so no, it doesn't get spared. It's a bit like that. Like, how many people are going to say no in thunder to the system? Or it doesn't have to be in thunder. That's some poetic reference. But as I say, it can be gentle. It can be no big fanfare, but stay aligned with goodness and with truth and with reality, no matter how deep and dark the gaslighting gets and how much the pressure and the coercion is to go along. I think we are probably seeing that. And it's not as straightforward as would you take an obviously very dodgy thing into your body that's being pushed by, draconian big pharma and government. Because to me, voting for Donald Trump is bad enough, really. I mean, at a certain point, with a certain level of awareness, I think an indication of complicity gets more and more subtle. That's why I worry about us even, like, is turning on our computer at a certain point, is that going to count for a strike against our soul?
Sure.
Because it is difficult. I mean, with Lent, again, I wanted to test that. How hard is it going to be to actually turn away from the spectacle and experience the discomfort and the feeling of isolation and alienation?
Was it as bad as you thought?
Actually, the internet wasn't hard at all.
Oh, okay.
No, I didn't really think it would be, but I thought it might be hard. I mean, I could have made it a lot harder, as I said. I couldn't, needless to say, I think I couldn't do 40 days and 40 nights just sitting in the desert doing nothing. I don't suppose anyone alive could. Well, actually, there's lots of heavy meditators, so they could.
Oh, sure. No, but I know what you mean. Even just doing like a digital Lent, as it were, sounds like it would be more challenging than people realise.
Well, I think, for most people carry their smartphones around and whatnot. Yeah, which I've never done that. But I mean, I've got an internet presence and I do, three posts a week, and I've got all the reason for doing it. But I was just finding that it was taking me away from where I needed to put my attention, which is what we've just been talking about. And so that's what I mean, I suppose, is that as the pressure increases, it's going to become harder and harder, and therefore more and more essential to be able to put our attention on the invisibles, on the invisible realms. Because the spectacle is going to get so overwhelmingly intense, and it will be the spectacle of humanity going down the tubes. Well, that is the spectacle that we're watching, frankly, right? But, as the last strand is swirling around in the toilet bowl, we have to be able to pull our attention away and make sure we don't get sucked down with it.
As a last topic, I had a thing I heard you reference, which is the notion that your vision of a solution to this kind of a prison, a way to transcend it, is essentially, you described it as it's the Tao, it's the thing that can't be described. And you said, almost as a way to just give the gist, that it's almost like spontaneity. And I had a thing I wanted to actually relate to you, which comes from my weird world of competitive video games, which is I can actually give you 2 examples of exactly the phenomenon you're talking about that I feel like parallel really crazy well with the idea of how do we essentially stand up against tyrannies and totalitarianism, which is, I'll give you 2 quick frames. One is that within a lot of the esports games I follow, the best country, like per capita or whatever, for producing great players and champions is actually South Korea. And the reason why is because they have this incredible sort of striver culture of like everyone is just going as hard as fuck to be like the A-star student in school and to be the person who's the top performer in their job. And across their whole society, they almost put it this way. I would say, I lived there for a while. They almost view it as like their duty that you have to try and be as excellent as possible in whatever you do. And so the competition is crazy, but also they don't just do it as in like succeed and you'll figure out how. You also have to succeed in a very restrictive, almost like top-down hierarchical manner, where I would essentially say the success of Koreans in these esports competitions is they're the best in the world at iterating like the most optimal way to play the game. What will happen is the people within their scene develop the next strategies and tactics, and then everyone almost like a robot copies and practices an insane amount until they can all sort of execute that copied theory out. And in general, that dominates the esports games in which South Korea is very prevalent and has a lot of people playing the game. But what's interesting is it doesn't mean though in those games that only Koreans win though. Every now and then you will actually get, it's often Westerners, it's people from Europe or North America, you will often get an outlier person who they might not have the raw ability of this Korean player. Maybe they're not as disciplined. They don't practice as much. They haven't iterated this exact approach over and over again. They've taken more of an individualistic Western approach of sort of like, I'm playing, this is fun, I'm doing things my way, I have strengths and weaknesses. I haven't always worked on all of them to the same degree. I'm maybe not as well polished, but essentially when those people if they have to be an outlier, they have to obviously have a lot of talent. This is a video game. But if they have enough talent, actually what you're talking about is essentially how they're able to sometimes win. They win by almost counteracting the robot machine do X, Y, Z in this order approach by spontaneity, by having like a creativity to the game, doing something no one's ever seen, playing in a way that's sort of a very intuitive, inspirational way. And then I'll also say similarly in another game I actually follow, which essentially Counter-Strike's a game that actually has like military components. Within that game, the traditional way to have a very dominant team, that's a team game, is you have a lot of tactics and a lot of strict things and you tell people what to do X, Y, and Z. But again, what is considered to transcend that is the best players individually are going to do things that aren't necessarily within the team concept, and that can actually supersede the team component. So I wanted to ask along these lines, and I get this is an incredibly broad question. It must be something you're still working on, thinking of. What do you kind of mean when you say like this spontaneity can transcend this set of circumstances we find ourselves in? What are you thinking of when you talk about that?
Well, because I want to have a spontaneous answer.
Sure.
It's not going to really count for much. So that's what I mean. Like, while you were talking there, I was trying to follow along, or I was following along, but I was also thinking, what's he going to ask and what shall I respond? and maybe coming up with this or that angle. And then when you actually finished your question, I did have a thought, oh, I could respond this. I was going to say something about, well, I didn't do it actually because I knew it was going to be a cliche. I was like coming off script or thinking outside the box.
Right.
So I didn't say that. So then I've ended up doing this preliminary thing. So that's the point, is whatever I say in response, if it's not a surprise to me, certainly not going to be a surprise to you. I mean,
Right.
probably not going to be a surprise to you. But if it is a surprise to me, it will definitely be a surprise to you, right? And so how do we allow for that? I guess that's one question. And what is that? So in the gospel, there's a bit there which has always stood out to me, because it seemed, I just thought it was a little bit odd, whereas Jesus said, a little bit surprising. He says to them, if you get questions on this, don't think about what you're going to say, because the Holy Spirit will speak through you.
Right.
I thought it was a little bit odd in a way, because, even 2,000 years ago, people were worried about public speaking.
Right.
Right? Somehow it just stood out, because that's so true now as a principle. The Holy Spirit obviously makes it, it's in a religious context, but it's very hard for us to not worry or wonder or speculate or try and prepare for if we're going to have to testify in some way or present and so on. So what is that? Letting the Holy Spirit speak through you. And we've talked today, haven't we, about how words don't cut it. That is something that in itself is a challenge, but also an opportunity, because what can I say? Like, there isn't the Holy Spirit, and I'm contradicting in a way because I'm naming it back to the Tao, right? Isn't something that can be translated directly into language. You see what I mean?
Yes.
The Holy Spirit starts to move me. What will that feel like? It might be a bit of heat somewhere in my body, or it might be a wave of energy, or any number of things that I either consciously or notice or I don't. But it's definitely not like Whitley Strieber has this implant in his eye and he can actually read it.
Right.
It's fast enough, and then it's dictating to him what he's going to say and write. It's definitely nothing like that. That'd be the technological counterfeit of it. So then this is free will, I suppose. So then in that margin, we have a choice. Are we going to allow the Holy Spirit to speak through us and without knowing what it's going to say, and we'll only find out when it comes out? Or will we intervene there a little bit and say, well, I'll just try and translate whatever that is.
Okay.
I'll just try and translate it first, and then I'll say it. Right? So, and I had another point. I've been slightly distracted for the last 30 seconds because I knew I was going to get to another point, you see, but now I've forgotten it. But anyway, to whatever extent I'm trying to demonstrate something. Obviously, this isn't just about speaking. This is also actions. I said this recently in the men's group. Like, every single move that we make, every thought that we have. Well, I was talking about myself, actually. Yeah, every move of the body, every decision I make, every thought, every time I speak, there's always a sense of, is this, the yachting or the sailing thing is yar, isn't it? A boat is yar if it's exactly rightly aligned with the wind or something like that. Built exactly right. The Zen, the archery thing about, sin being when you miss the mark. Am I actually in precise alignment with the life force, like a baby would be, like all its body is moving? And paradoxically, a baby, of course, hasn't learned motor control and stuff, but the life force is fully distributed, and it puts everything it has into everything it does. So are we like that, or are we not? And to what extent? So it's possible to be observing that. a lot, maybe all the time, and course correcting, always course correcting. And that I associate, it sounds paradoxical because that sounds like one is constantly kind of modulating. Well, one is constantly modulating, and yet it's contradictory because that is always moving towards spontaneity. It's moving towards a more spontaneous expression. So the more spontaneous expression I'm able to have, the less of that jarring feeling I feel of that wasn't quite, didn't quite, right? So anyway, does that answer it?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean.
I know what I know. My drop point was that it was using language as an example, that the system that we are now trapped in, or at least we're in it, and we feel trapped, is a language-based system, which we've talked about today.
Yes.
Basically runs but on rules of language, and that's a counterfeit of in the beginning was the word, the logos. All of existence is a language-based system, but it's a divine language that we don't understand and we don't speak it, and we can't say much about it. We've tried to talk about it today. So then there's this counterfeit, the Satan's domain, which is language-based in a way we can talk about, because it's the English language. It's all the other languages, Latin and Greek and all these other languages before the English language, and now it's computer programming. And that is mathematical.
Yes.
Like Hebrew was a mathematical system. And therefore it's controllable, it's programmable.
Yes.
Like it follows exact principles like you and your gamers, right?
Yes.
That's the thing. That's why only the Holy Spirit can actually get through that system without being confined or defined by it or imprisoned to it, because basically anything else can be predicted. Like it's smarter than we are, this system.
Yes.
Because it is the system that we are following. So of course it's smarter than we are. So the only thing smarter than the system and the only thing smarter than Satan is Logos, Christ, and trusting in that. So it's not exactly that spontaneity is the answer. It's just that spontaneity is the only way to allow that thing to move us.
I think I kind of vibe with it. Like, put it this way, when you're saying that, I'm thinking of the idea that like spontaneity is almost just a word in this case. I'll use just be humorous. It's almost like what you're saying is in certain moments you have to do like a Jesus take the wheel type thing. And it's like if you actually did try to think rationally, or what would be the approach to this? Well, the reason why that could obviously be subverted is, like you said about my question naturally, even if I think about what you might answer, will have certain things that would follow on from what I just said. So in some ways, if you say that, even though your brain said, hey, my answer will be what follows on from what you say, in some ways that's not really you answering. That's just the obvious thing to say. Like you said, it's the cliche. So I have to say it. I also heard you on a podcast say something quite evocative. You said something along the lines of like, you almost, it wouldn't be this exact phrasing, but the gist was you almost described it as like what people call the unconscious is almost itself like a secularization of the idea of like demons or other entities or something else interfacing with us. Because essentially, if you think before the psychological revolution, people did think of things as the idea of like the devil's tempting you or God's pushing you in this direction. And on some level, I see what you mean. If you allow essentially the unconscious to drive everything, well, that is, as far as I can tell, the main thing the system programs is the unconscious. So then you will think that your idea or your response to something is organic, as it were. But I sort of get the vibe, because put it this way, one of the things I've found as a battle within myself is I've found most things I think are negative about my personality or my behavior. It almost is like I'm negotiating it within myself. Like anytime I do be lazy or do the thing that's negative for my health or my time or my whatever, my soul, it almost feels like I am talking to, you can call it the unconscious, something within myself, and it's saying, do this thing. And then I either agree and acquiesce to it, or I sort of say no, and I'm going to do something else. But in this particular case, to you, it's almost like you just remove yourself and then wait for the divine to speak through you, or wait for something more pure to come through you.
Well, myself being, a conglomeration of these unconscious currents, which are childhood patterning, ancestral, and then the entities that got mixed in there.
Yes.
and my ego conscious false identity self, which is kind of one size fits all, but a big part, well, two main parts of it really are, and they're complementary. One is scapegoating, to use the Girardian term, like finding somebody to blame or feel superior to.
Sure.
And the other is complementary, it's just trying to please. They're both to do with trying to belong and be part of a community or a tribe. Because if we can agree who we're better than or who we hate, we get unified by
Yes.
that agreement. But also, if we're nice to each other, that unifies us. So a big part of it, to make it a bit more practical, is to neutralize those two things, particularly because it's more conscious, the pleaser. So when you ask a question, part of me is scrambling for an answer, however cool I might remain on the outside, to please you.
Right.
Not to create frisson
Sure.
and tension there. And that, so as much as I can neutralize that thing, that socially conditioned identity that wants to give the right answer or do the right thing, back to COVID, aren't we? How that was used to manipulate people, the responsibility to one's community. So the more I can neutralize that, getting that out of the way. So there is something else that I would say that is me, that is who I am, that is expressing. Therefore, and Paul would say that's the Christ in me. And okay, fair enough. I mean, again, those are big words. The soul is a big word too.
Yeah.
But we need these big words, I suppose, because we can talk about the obstacles fairly well.
Yes, exactly. The solutions are the hardest to talk about, though. Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, it doesn't mean anything if we're not going to say,
Yes.
well, what's actually going to get over the obstacle at the end of the day. But it has to be, I mean, this is what I think we have been talking about just in the last few minutes. Or have we, or not? The proof is in the pudding, is the cliche, but
yes.
I mean, something has to be being embodied and exemplified that is rich and full of meaning for us. And so the words, it's not, I'm going to fall back on the cliche again, but it really isn't what I say, but the spirit with which I say something. If I'm enthused, and not in the sense of being passionate about my convictions, but in the sense of just the sheer enjoyment of being a conduit or a channel for some sort of truth, that's the thing that wants to communicate that we can have this experience of being close to the truth and being able to express the truth. That's the thing of value. It's not really in the flattened out version of it.
It's why I referenced earlier, to me, I mean, again, it's a simplistic way to say it, but it is the experience, not the explanation or the reasons why. Like, it's why I actually have found, I now get why it's so difficult to ever have discussions, especially with people who consider themselves atheistic, because essentially all they're doing is asking you a million variations of the question, can you logically and rationally prove to me that this thing is true? And then therefore I might listen. Whereas all you're telling them over and over again in vague language is, it's really something that you have to experience for yourself. And unless you feel this calling or hear the voice inside yourself, I can't really totally express it, and you'll never really understand it.
Well, I mean, I know at least one atheist who, at least he describes himself that way, who seems to embody a kind of faith, and he has a moral core, and he just seems to me, I don't know how to say it. It's not like he seems religious, but he seems like he has he's soulful. He's a soulful person. And so he just sort of, insofar as it's true about him, I haven't asked him about it recently, insofar as he's chosen to identify as atheistic, it's pretty superficial. And a lot of people are religious in that way. It's superficial.
Yes, absolutely.
Feel that they're that they're embodying, or they're clearly communicating a sense of religious being. It's just part of their social identity. So again, I mean, it's what people choose to talk about, I suppose. But I think it's in that example, I don't really know what to say. But a lot of people who do choose the atheistic position and always want evidence and all the rest of it, the simple way is to define that is that they're in their heads, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
So a person can be religious, but it's in the head religion as well.
Yes.
It's just that generally there's a correlation between atheism and being in your head. But the problem is being in the head. And this is a real problem that doesn't get talked about very much. It's a bit of a cliche, so I suppose.
No, but all these topics end up like that, I feel like, because as we're saying, it's almost ineffable, right?
But the internet, and bringing it back to AI and stuff, the internet really encourages in the headness.
Absolutely.
So it's a real challenge for me today, but generally to talk to you for 2.5 hours and stay out of my head as much as possible.
Right.
Because, well, we're not, and don't even have video, right? It's without the words, and the words are all in the head, even without words.
That's true.
Implant,
that's true.
Right? Or at least that's how I experience them. It's almost as if there is a little commentator in my brain dictating words. And certainly if I speak, obviously it's coming out of my head, but that's where my mouth is. So this is definitely a problem, and I think it's why the future human being who's a robot body for Iron Man looks like these little grey aliens, I think, with these swollen heads and these shriveled up bodies.
One of the things that's famous about my interviews is I don't really like to do that classic thing like, so what are you working on next? And where it's like, like the shill segment. But I have a way to sort of ask something along those lines, which is a topic I did want to end on is, one of the things I found quite interesting, I asked you about this in the last episode, is there was a period in your time where you were the Matrix warrior. You were someone who had sort of a savior complex, and you did actually have quite a traditional sort of idea of like, I've been awakened in a way, I've got to spread this message to the world, and it will have some sort of giant change effect maybe in society. And it felt like there was a time where maybe that was like a big attractor for you, or the idea that you wanted the world to know your message. So what I want to ask was, it does seem to me as an outsider like you've got a very different approach in the last few years. In fact, obviously a lot of the projects you're working on now seem much more personal than rather sort of towards society. And some of the things you work on now are almost the idea of you quite literally collect a small group of people and you just work with those people on whatever level you engage with them on. You're not necessarily trying to like get the megaphone and stand on the soapbox and speak to the whole world. So what I want to ask is, how does this jive with your own notion of like, does that mean you've given up the idea of trying to en masse affect the world with your ideas? Does it mean is that just not an effective approach? Is it better to work on the person to person level to some degree and a bit more niche?
Well, if you're given lemons, you make lemonade, right?
Right.
So I've just had to learn to work with what the circumstances that I've ended up in, and so even in terms of my small online groups, I've continued to try and get more people. I don't know if I started getting more than 15 or 20, what I would do, because I do think it doesn't work after a certain point in my experience, but I've never really tested that because I've never had a consistent large number of people, right? So, but it's moot because I'm lucky if I can get 7 people to
right. You don't have a choice, right?
Right? Even though I've got 3,000 followers on Substack and 200 paying subscribers, give or take, I'm lucky if I can get half a dozen of those to actually show up. So there's something about what I do which just is a natural filter. I've been thinking recently, I finally noticed that Jesus feeds 5,000 people. Like, he was just wandering around in Palestine for a few months, really, or a couple of years, and he gets 5,000 people. Back then, that would have been
that's nuts. Yeah, that's like Wembley Stadium, then, mate.
Yeah, it's puzzling actually to me. I had never really recognised that that's kind of inconsistent with generally my message or my understanding, which is that you've got to work with small groups, and Jesus had 12, and then 72 was the larger group. but occasionally he did large public appearances. Yeah, I've been on the Lotus Eaters. I've been on James Delingpole. I just did. I would do Joe Rogan probably if he asked. He's not going to ask, but
Sure.
I would do that stuff with the probably misguided idea that I might bring more people in, and therefore there'll be a couple of the right people. Because that so far that hasn't seemed to.
By the way, just to let me ask you about that. Actually, I was actually quite shocked. Like, look, obviously I've watched a lot of your stuff on YouTube, so I automatically in the algorithm get anything new. I was very shocked when I saw you on the Lotus Eaters, though, because obviously that's like a very much like nuts and bolts. It's in the mainstream of politics to some degree. Admittedly, people would say it's the alt side of the slight fringe, but it's quite well known online in sort of British political consciousness. One thing I was kind of surprised by your appearance, though, is I really did wonder when they were talking to you how much did they want it to be about like Big Brother and that sort of like what would fit essentially within their worldview? Because I was wondering when I was watching that episode, were they ever going to veer into sort of like aliens or something? I noticed they didn't really. It felt like they sort of kept you on the rails a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they did. I mean, I enjoyed the conversation because he read the book and
it worked well. It was a good segment. Yeah, yeah.
But sure, I mean, I was aware at the time that they have their platform, and that's why they're speaking to me, and that's the way it is. And sometimes it's more obvious, and sometimes it's less obvious. But it was also a rare case of being actually in the room with the guy.
Oh yeah, sure.
So I enjoyed it, but it didn't lead to anything. I mean, as far as I know, nobody else contacted me as a result of that. So that's a good indication. I still have that it, nothing I do is going to change anything. I still have this unfulfilled need to be recognized in the mainstream. And I don't think it's quite as simple as, wanting recognition exactly. It's kind of just wanting to contribute to the understanding of things in a way that's outside of an echo chamber. And to me, I don't think I create an echo chamber because of what we're talking about here. I'm very challenging even to my followers.
Sure.
The men's group certainly isn't an echo chamber and so on. But the second matrix itself is an echo chamber. So a lot of the people who come read me and come to me, they're in this second matrix.
Oh, by the way, on the other end of the equation, I also notice when you go on the really heavy conspiracy podcasts, they're almost trying to bring you into all the areas that often you speak against, actually, certain things. But they're already on some of the sort of classical conspiracy angle. They're trying to bundle it all together.
Yeah, well, James Delingpole was trying to argue that there's a unified one conspiracy over it all. And my point was, well, that's your opinion. Maybe I agree, but I don't have any comment because I don't know.
Right.
Show me the evidence.
Yes.
I'm evidence-based research because it's not research otherwise. So, and the evidence should speak for itself with a little bit of interpreting. But whereas the second matrix is it's too much theory and not enough evidence, I think, would be a way to sum it up. And yeah, I get tired of actually that thing. So then I kind of yearn to be recognized in the first matrix. Because,
right.
Well, it just seems that my ideas would be more relevant in some ways, in other ways not, because obviously I can directly address people's belief in the second matrix because they already believe them. Whereas if I talk about the moon landing being fake in the first matrix, I'm a tinfoil hat,
of course, yes.
right away, right?
Yes.
So obviously there's problems, but I am actually still currently working on something, whether I'll ever get to it, which is aimed somewhat for the mainstream, like a non-paranoid text, because I'm interested, I'm a bit tired of having these opinions, and it's not like I want to try new opinions because I'm not going to change the way I see the world, but I don't necessarily have to argue them and try and convince.
Yes.
Right? And one can write about or talk about the world without saying, oh, that person's dodgy because look, it's CFR and this.
Yes.
Right? One can just be more subtle and slip it in here and there. And so currently I've been reading a lot of conventional history books, really, about the 60s, and currently reading a book about the media throughout its history, really. by a mainstream journalist who's very respected, and I find it's quite refreshing because I never really got that informed about history. And then at the point where I did start reading seriously, I poo-pooed it all because it was all lies anyway.
Sure.
Well, that's too simple. Of course, it's not all lies. It's just that it's all spin. It's all spun.
Yes.
But there aren't many writers like Carroll Quigley who I have to read. Quigley or Quilty, I always get confused. Tragedy and Hope.
Yeah.
Sort of mainstream like Anthony Sutton I've been reading, who address history through a conspiratorial lens. Generally, it's kind of either or. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
It's either just the official version, or it's conspiracy books that they don't seem very well grounded in history, if you know what I mean. So I'd like to get more grounded in history.
Does this connect to the idea that this is also part of how we people transcend the idea? Because essentially what you're talking about here, you're right. If everyone has these super detailed and really out there like angles on all conspiracy things, but it only ever can exist in the second matrix, that can't really affect the overall system. It's just going to essentially be the people who think they've escaped the matrix now have their own thing that they're going on about. And essentially you're preaching to the choir, right? Whereas, as you say, on some level, even though you can't bring a second matrix awareness to people in the first matrix, if your message could more broadly speak to the first matrix, that would have the bigger effect on the world, right?
Well, theoretically, but I don't really have illusions about that. It's possible that if I could get away with it and get a mainstream publisher, etc., and get reviewed by The Guardian, I don't have any illusions about it really changing society or reaching loads of people. But it's still possible it would reach a few people who might be kind of heavy hitters and more deep thinkers, right, but somehow they'd stayed away from this, and this was a gateway for them. That's possible, but I have to say that's really secondary, and maybe we'll bring it back to your actual original question. Maybe it's secondary to what I think is more essential for me, which is that I do think it would be helpful if I could somehow allow myself to feel connected to the collective a bit more, and not feel like I'm out on this front line. It was just even in the second matrix, I feel like I'm ahead of everybody else, right? I've got this super ego, this superiority complex, which is part of what keeps me.
It's also part of your charm and what people like about probably why you do some of the things. By the way, one thing that this ties into that you said earlier was, as you said earlier on, one of the biggest problems of being in the internet space is you do see all these extreme opinions and then the joke is you do disconnect, and it really is just like, people seem fairly normal when you go and see your friends and your family and the people in the street. Like on some level, you have to be able to come out of it and engage with that level too, yeah?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And the other thing is that, reading about the history, I'm getting a sense of what my father was interested in, because he was interested in politics and stuff in a way that I would have, first of all, I'd have had no interest in when I was younger, and then I would have just poo-pooed all of it because I said, no, it's all a conspiracy. You're being lied to, you're being fooled. And I think the generation gap is very profound in the last century.
Oh, for sure.
And I think that unmoors us also from reality, essentially. I think we need to have a connection to the previous generations, to our ancestors, even if they were wrong.
Has that given you a more, I don't know if generous is the right word, has that given you a more eye-opening perspective on your father? Because I know when you've talked about your father in the past, it often is the idea that he was directly embedded in the conspiracy. He was part of the Fabians, and he had this like business connections and stuff. And there's even allusions to the idea he was on the fringes of some of the darker things if he wasn't directly involved. Does that is the notion that by seeing kind of the history that would have informed his worldview, that makes it less sinister, if that's the right word? Has it helped your connection with him, do you think?
Well, it's certainly the latter is the most broad way of putting it. It was more my grandfather than my father.
Oh, right, your grandfather.
My father was kind of lost.
Right.
In many ways. But so the main thing is, these are things that were interesting to him. And he might have not known what was going on, but who does, right?
Sure.
And he definitely knew a lot more about some things than I did. And I didn't have any conversations with him, and I didn't know what to talk to him about, and he didn't know what to talk to me about. Whereas if he were alive now, I have all kinds of questions.
Right.
And I have all kinds of things I'd want to talk to them about. And I don't think I'd have too much of a problem saying, no, you're being fooled there. That's really the Council of Foreign Relations. I could just
Right.
introduce it slowly and strategically. Anyway, point is we could have a dialogue. It's too late, but not too late in myself to somehow create a bridge there. And I think that's valuable in itself. And so, yeah, the broader context is, um, to the extent that I've intentionally estranged myself from other people and from society and dismissed all of history and all the rest of it. Well, now I see that the internet's doing that to all of us, and I don't think it's really a good thing. Actually, when we've got cancel culture, that's all about just rejecting the ancestors, isn't it? It's all patriarchy thrown.
Absolutely.
So conspiracy consciousness has actually shown me, because it's gone mainstream, it's made me realize that, well, I'm not as unconventional as I thought, for one thing, but also that it's a trap in and of itself, actually, to throw out the baby of history with the bathwater.
Yes.
There's something of value in there.
It's like what you were saying about Christianity. There's signal noise, definitely. There's loads of it. As you say, it's clearly been shaped a certain way, but there's also some signal in there, right?
Right. So, and finding, I mean, this is a personal project, so it's hard for me to talk about. I know we're rounding up, so I want to bring it back to your
Yeah,
question.
go for
But
it.
I am trying to make sense of, I've been trying to make sense of the world for a long time, and that is making sense of my own life. So I'm looking back a period in history, when I was growing up and stuff. And so it's a personal investigation, but it does involve reading all these conventional history books, and so it's orienting me more towards this more conventional viewpoint, which I feel is helping to ground my very unconventional viewpoint, bringing the two together, because they both need each other. Like the
Yes.
second matrix needs the ground of just some more established facts and stuff, rather than just jumping in at the deep end and saying it's all fake, because that's where it ends up with
It
something
does,
like
yes.
Mars
It becomes
Matters.
reductive in its
Everything
own
is
way,
fake.
yeah.
Right? So, but the first matrix obviously needs some injection from conspiracy awareness and all the rest of it. So bringing the two into balance, I think, is healthy for me personally. Now, but as far as what your question was about, um, being on the fringes and stuff, I doubt that that's ever going to change, to be honest. You never know. You never know. But the I think the main thing is do I need it to? Do I want it to? And if so, why? And I
Yes.
think the question I mean, the answer is really, I definitely don't need it to. If I want it to, it's mostly because, well, the positive reason why, let's say, because there's obvious negative ones, and we're rounding up, so we won't go into my own neuroses,
Sure.
needing to belong and all that, or needing to have my own cult. But the positive is that we are running out of time individually, of course, all of us, but I think collectively something big is coming along, AI or UFOs or whatever it is. And I am sincere and serious about uh, offering a space and bringing people together in real community away from the internet. So currently that's never going to happen, because if I'm going to get 6 people for a men's meet,
Right.
I'm never going to get 6, never mind 16 people here to Spain, right? So there is a practical reason why I'd like to extend my reach a little bit more, but I don't know what I can, everything I've tried to contrive that hasn't worked. So I think I mostly have to just let go and let God, they say, just keep more or less doing what I'm doing and just see if the signal gets louder, if I reduce the noise, and see if there's any echoing, calls out there coming from wherever they come.
Since I started with a personal question about your writing, I actually have one to end. I thought this would be a neat way to sort of bookend it, which goes like this. One thing I've found in my own experience as a creative person that I think maybe when you're just someone who consumes other people's creations, you might not think about, is people often think of it as you've sort of got the idea in your head and you're just translating it externally so other people can experience it. But I have to say, my own personal experience of doing things like writing or speaking is it's not really until I come to the process of that expression that I actually think it's the other way around. It's almost like the process of explaining it or putting it into words or formalizing the thought makes me actually decide what I think or what I really believe. And I don't totally know until that moment. Like, I'd be more vague when I'm thinking the idea or it's occurring to me as just something inside my head. And so I wanted to know, it's kind of like a sense I have of what you're writing. I could be misplaced. Is there some degree to which when you write these books, either the research process or the process of actually writing the book itself, like sort of informs you, teaches you what's going on as opposed to just you expressing an idea you had?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's more than, or less than 50-50. I think, well, let's say it's 50-50, but I don't know what the ratio is. But I would say it's at least as much discovering. I would say it even goes beyond that, because sometimes I was feeling this when I reread my last Substack post. I don't necessarily agree with what I've written.
Right.
I'm quite glad I wrote it, because it was the logic of my argument and my evidence that led me to write that. And so I have to include it. And at the time it felt true, but when I read it back, I think, do I really want to say that? I don't know, but that's what the evidence led me to. So that's, it's always moving, right? These are just descriptions anyway, and my books particularly, because they're very research heavy. They're attempts to arrange evidence in a way that creates a description or a map of a certain aspect of the world or history, and therefore they're partial, incomplete, and therefore temporary. I mean, better ones will come along, whether it's better books or better maps of the territory. But then beyond even that, about like the thing about books kind of being dead shells that get left behind after something is born, that these maps are there. Well, sometimes they're actually, this is territory I'm trying to make it through, so I'm making the map before I proceed. But sometimes they're the opposite, which is this is territory I'm leaving behind.
Right.
So I don't need the map anymore, but there it is. You know, insofar as I crossed this unknown country and made it known, this is the evidence of that, and somebody who's coming after can contest it. It might be useful, right? So they're definitely temporary and somewhat disposable. It is about changing consciousness, absolutely. I mean, I love writing as a practice and as a pleasure for me, and I don't think it would be that, and I don't think there'd be any good reason to do it if my consciousness wasn't being transformed through writing. Because a lot of our consciousness is shackled to thinking, and a lot of our thinking is shackled to words, language.
Yes. So
evolving our relationship to words can be transforming. So I think that's really what it's about. Is that really trying to get to grips with my own programming.
Without the noble families of the Italian city-states, you may never have heard of or been able to appreciate the art of some of the greatest Renaissance artists of all time. And similarly, my content on this channel, which I consider art, is kindly supported by Abradiation and the rest of my Patreon supporters. Do you want to choose one of the topics that I might focus on next in a video? Maybe you want to ask me a question that I'll answer in a video AMA. Do you want teasers? Find out who the upcoming guests are for Thor Inquiry. Maybe you want to take part in one of those private, never to be released, recorded for your benefit discussions with me one-on-one, where you can talk about almost any topic, assuming it's appropriate. Well, if any of those perks or others tickle your fancy, heed this call to action and join Thor Inside today at the Patreon link in the description box below.